Hi guys. Tonight we settle into a place where stone walls are thick, but the winter winds are thicker still. You're standing in the great courtyard of a medieval castle, and the air bites as though it were sharpened on icicles. Every breath you take feels like a blade slipping into your chest. The battlements above are frosted white, and the guards who pace them stamp their boots hard just to keep the blood moving in their toes. Inside the walls, life is no less frigid. The halls echo with the draught of air sneaking through arrow slits, and the fires never seem quite large enough to banish the cold. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is right now as you press play. Now, dim the lights. You probably wouldn't survive this night in a castle without a good stockpile. The stones radiate damp, and no matter how many tapestries you drape across the walls, they can't warm the belly. That's where food comes in, or more honestly, where the lack of food becomes painfully obvious. A castle might look impressive from the outside, but during the coldest stretch of winter, it was more like a prison of hunger. Fires in the great hall offered only temporary comfort, and the true battle was fought at the table. Picture yourself stepping onto the flagstones of the kitchen passage. The air here is thicker, filled with smoke that makes your eyes water. Somewhere down the corridor, you hear the crack of logs being shoved onto the fire. The cooks are busy, their sleeves rolled high, and their breath visible even in the supposed warmth of the kitchen. They move quickly, not because the food is plentiful, but because stretching meager supplies takes ingenuity. And ingenuity, in winter, was worth more than gold. Mainstream chronicles describe castles as having ample stores of food, with cellars full of salted meats and grains piled high in sacks. That's true for the richest lords, but the reality for most households was far leaner. Salted pork might last a few weeks, yet by January the flavor turned sharp, the fat yellowing and rancid around the edges. Bread, too, was always there, though not the soft loaves you dream of. Instead, think of heavy rye or barley bread, baked hard enough to resist mold, and so dense it could double as a weapon if thrown across the hall. A quirky detail comes from records of trenchers, thick slabs of bread used not as food but as plates. On a cold night, you'd set your stew or broth on the trencher, let the juices soak in, and then either eat it later when softened, or toss it to the dogs. Imagine gnawing on that rock-hard bread, teeth aching from the cold, wondering whether the hound got the better deal. Historians still argue whether castles truly managed to insulate their pantries enough to protect supplies from frost. Some claim underground storerooms kept food stable. Others point out that damp air spoiled flour quickly. The debate itself highlights how precarious winter survival was. Even a wealthy lord could not always guarantee that his household would eat well through February. The noise of the great hall carries through the stone. You hear voices, men grumbling about portions too small, servants whispering about when the next hunting party will bring back fresh game. Hunger does that. It strips away politeness and reveals the anxious truth beneath. And tonight, in this castle, that truth is simple. The cold is winning. Step closer to the high table. Candles flicker, throwing halos of golden light onto the faces of the noble family. Their meal looks abundant. Platters of roasted meats, cups of ale, dishes seasoned with what little spice remains. Yet glance down the table, and you'll see the contrast. Servants huddle with bowls of thin pottage, the broth steaming weakly, more water than grain. You might envy the nobility for a heartbeat, but even their bounty has limits. Salted venison grows tough, poultry dwindles, and the glamour fades when the nights are long. One curious tidbit whispers from old records. During especially bitter winters, nobles sometimes turned to foods thought warming, not by calories but by medieval humoral theory. Ginger, saffron, or even peppercorns were believed to heat the body from within. It wasn't always practical, but belief itself was a kind of insulation against despair. Your own breath hangs in front of you now as you wander past the tables, eyeing scraps and crusts left behind. The wind moans outside, rattling shutters that barely hold. Somewhere in the shadows, you catch the metallic scent of cold iron from armor hung by the fire, and the faint sweetness of ale poured into wooden cups. This is winter in a castle, an orchestra of hunger, hope, and survival. By the time you reach the far hearth, the fire is guttering low. Someone tosses on another log, sparks leaping upward like startled fireflies. The warmth reaches you only faintly, just enough to remind you how cold you truly are. You tuck your hands into your cloak and think about the food you've just seen. Salted meat, hard bread, weak stew, enough to keep life ticking, but not enough to chase away the chill. The night will drag on. The stone will remain icy beneath your feet, and while you wait for morning, you'll realize something unsettling. In this castle, the most terrifying predator is not lurking in the forest beyond the walls. It's right here, gnawing quietly in every stomach. You leave behind the dying embers of the hearth and descend a narrow stair into the bowels of the castle. The air grows colder, heavier, and tinged with the tang of stone that has soaked up centuries of damp. This is where survival rests deep in the pantries, the salt cellars, the cool recesses dug beneath the fortress to keep food edible as long as humanly possible. What you see is not abundance, but a quiet gamble with time. Rows of barrels line the walls, each sealed with wax and rope, each one precious. Within them, hunks of pork, sides of beef, or slabs of venison float in brine, so sharp it stings your nose. The salt itself had been expensive, carried in from distant coasts, and without it, the winter menu would collapse entirely. You reach into one barrel and imagine the texture rubbery, heavy with brine, tough enough to chew for minutes before swallowing. But when the snow falls endlessly outside, you don't complain. You're just grateful the meat hasn't spoiled. Mainstream chronicles record castles as centers of plenty, but we know most households rationed these salted stores carefully. A slice of pork might be cut thin enough to see the light pass through, just to stretch it across several mouths. For the servants, the broth in which the meat had soaked might be the closest they'd get to tasting it. A quirky anecdote comes from a 14th century household roll noting how salt fish, particularly herring, became so common in winter that jokes compared castle kitchens to harbours. Imagine a freezing January night, the wind howling through the slits in the walls, and the smell of salted fish pervading every corridor until even your bedclothes carried the scent. Yet historians still argue whether the salting process truly preserved flavour or merely disguised rot. Some suggest the spices often added to these barrels weren't for taste at all, but to cover the creeping sourness of meat gone bad. Others counter that careful households kept stores surprisingly fresh until Lent was over. The truth probably lay somewhere in the middle. Some lucky barrels lasted, others delivered a nasty surprise when opened too late. As you stand among these barrels, the sounds of dripping brine echo, a slow rhythm in the cavernous room. Candles gutter and smoke, and you shiver. Each cask is both a lifeline and a countdown, a reminder that food is finite and winter is patient. You run your hand along one lid, feel the chill seep through your skin, and wonder just how long this supply will hold. The servants who work here move like shadows, dipping buckets into brine, hauling salted joints up to the kitchens. Their arms ache from carrying such loads up the spiral stairs, but no one complains. Every trip keeps the castle alive another night. One boy sneaks a finger into the brine, licks the salty sting, and grimaces. It's hardly appetizing, but in these depths, even salt feels like life. You turn back toward the stair and think of how strange this reliance. Island fresh meat meant feasting, salted meat meant surviving. The noble upstairs might dream of roasted venison with pepper sauce. But down here the reality is far less romantic. Slabs of flesh leaching into liquid, waiting for a cook's ingenuity. And when the blizzards rage outside, nobody dares sneer at a slice of chewy, salty beef. The castle groans as wind presses against its towers, and in the silence that follows, you can almost hear the stomachs rumbling above. Pantries of salted hope, that's what they truly are. Not treasure vaults, not endless bounty, just the brittle line between hunger and endurance. You climb back toward the kitchens, and the smell hits you first. Not fresh-baked baguettes or golden buttered rolls, but something far more severe. The bread of a medieval castle was the backbone of every meal, especially on freezing nights when meat was scarce. It was not the kind of loaf you would proudly set on a modern table. Instead, picture a dark, compact brick, cut from coarse grains, barely risen, its crust so tough you might crack a tooth if you weren't careful. Bread was life, but it was not luxury. Contemporary accounts consistently note that even great households relied on barley, rye, or maslin loaves, a mix of whatever grain was available. Wheat, the prized grain for fine white bread, was so expensive it often graced only the Lord's table, and even then in limited amounts. For everyone else, the bread was heavy, dark, and intended to endure as long as the winter itself. One unexpected glimpse from the era reveals the practice of drying loaves until they were nearly as hard as stone, only to soften them later in broth or ale. These weren't delicate treats, they were survival tools. You could tuck one into your belt and march across icy fields without fear of it spoiling. When hunger gnawed late at night, you dropped it into hot pottage, and slowly, stubbornly, the bread gave way. There remains disagreement among researchers about how trenchers those slabs of bread used as edible plates were consumed. Some argue that they were eaten by the poor after the nobles had finished, while others believe they were so saturated with grease and sauce that they were fed only to dogs. Either way, the sight of these bread dishes in the castle hall tells you something essential. Bread was too valuable to waste, even when its role was secondary. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sounds around the trestle tables. A servant drops a trencher with a dull thud, another slices through a round loaf with a sawing motion. The crust flakes scatter like grit on the stone floor. The hall is dimly lit, and as steam curls upward from pots of stew, the bread soaks it in. You take a bite, and the flavor is earthy, sour even, the taste of soil and toil captured in every crumb. A curious little note from household accounts mentions that bread could be baked weeks in advance, stacked high in pantries, and marked with symbols to distinguish batches. One family's rolls bore tiny cross marks to signify blessed bread, while others were left plain. Imagine being a kitchen servant, rummaging through those piles, looking for the least stale option, and realizing with a sinking heart that least stale was the best you could hope for. The nutritional value mattered more than the flavor. Dense loaves provided the calories needed to keep bodies moving in the unheated chambers. But they carried risks, too. In lean years, when good grain ran short, peasants sometimes ground acorns or peas into flour. The result was filling, but bitter, and sometimes harmful. Specialists continue to wrestle with the puzzle of just how often famine bread, a mix of whatever could be crushed and baked, was eaten inside castle walls. Was it a desperate measure for peasants only, or did even noble kitchens occasionally stoop to such extremes? You glance around the kitchen and see the ovens glowing faintly, heat leaking out like whispers. The bakers' arms are dusted white with flour, their brows dripping with sweat despite the chill. They haul out loaves, stack them on wooden boards, and scold young boys who try to snatch pieces while still hot. The rhythm of bread making is timeless. Knead, shape, bake, ration. In winter, though, each loaf feels less like a meal and more like a bargaining chip. Bread shaped more than diets. It shaped hierarchy. Chronicles of the period suggest that a lord might be served fine manchet bread, soft and pale, while his retainers gnawed on coarse maslin. The difference wasn't just in taste but in symbolism. A slice of white bread implied wealth and rank, while dark bread implied you were lower on the ladder. Imagine looking down the table and seeing who chewed what it was as much a signal of status as the cut of cloth on your shoulders. Yet bread had moments of delight too. On feast days, loaves might be spiced with caraway or anise, or brushed with honey for a touch of sweetness. Such occasions stood out sharply against the monotony of plain crusts. You would savor that hint of luxury, lick the sweetness from your lips, and then sigh when the feast ended, knowing the next day would return you to the same old chew. An oddity that survives in anecdotal form is the belief that stale bread was healthier for digestion than fresh. Physicians of the time advised against eating new bread, straight from the oven, claiming it caused stomach aches and sluggishness. So even if you were lucky enough to catch a warm loaf, you might be warned to wait, chewing instead on something 2 or 3 days old. You'd smile politely and obey, but in your heart, you'd long for that steamy, fresh crust. Picture now a family gathered at the lower end of the hall, cradling bowls of broth into which hunks of bread have been dropped. The steam rises, the crusts soften, and slowly, mouths open in relief. It isn't glamorous, but it fills the emptiness. Upstairs, the noble children are fed dainty slices of lighter bread, yet even they glance enviously at the broth-soaked trenchers. Hunger has a way of evening everyone out. The wind howls outside, and the shutters bang once, twice. You imagine the bread piled in pantries trembling with each gust. In your hand, a loaf feels like a stone, its surface rough, its smell faintly sour. You tear off a piece, dunk it in ale, and chew until your jaw aches. The cold lingers, the hunger lingers, but at least you are eating. And so, as the night deepens, bread remains the silent companion of every soul in the castle. Hard, heavy, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, always present. It does not chase away the cold, but it ensures you wake tomorrow with enough strength to light the fire again. In a world of frost and scarcity, a crust of bread is not just food. It is the thin line between despair and endurance. You move closer to the heart of the kitchen, where a massive cauldron bubbles steadily, its surface shimmering with steam that twists upward to meet the blackened beams overhead. This is no delicate pot of soup, it's pottage, the thick and endlessly adaptable stew that sustained castle dwellers more than any other dish. If bread was the foundation of survival, pottage was the mortar that held winter together. Imagine the sound: a wooden ladle scraping the bottom of the cauldron, the occasional splash as ingredients are tossed in beans, barley, chopped carrots, onions, or whatever happened to be on hand. The smell is earthy and comforting, though sometimes tinged with sourness if yesterday's remnants were stirred into today's brew. And indeed, that was the trick. Pottage was never really new. It was a perpetual meal, simmering day after day, fed with scraps and scraps again, thickening as it aged. One well-documented detail from medieval accounts is the reliance on legumes, peas, beans, and lentils as staples in winter pottage. They kept well, filled bellies, and offered strength to labourers who braved the icy winds on guard duty or in the fields. A lord might sneer at such plain fare, but when snow buried the roads, even the highborn were grateful for a bowl of something warm. A curious little note from a 15th century inventory describes the practice of tossing in a bone, not for the meat which was long since stripped, but for the marrow flavour that seeped out slowly over hours. Imagine gnawing hunger giving way to relief as even the ghost of meat enriched the stew. You'd take what you could get, spoon after spoon, the hot broth thawing your frozen fingers as you clutched the bowl. Some experts maintain that pottage was a democratic dish, eaten across all ranks, while others insist that nobles kept a more refined version, enriched with saffron or almond milk. Modern scholarship hasn't fully settled the question, but the truth likely shifted with circumstance. On feast days, the same cauldron might gleam with golden spices, while in harsher weeks it barely stretched to onions and oats. The texture was hearty, sometimes lumpy, and never the same twice. You might scoop up a mouthful rich with barley, then find the next filled with watery cabbage. Children would lick their bowls clean, while adults lingered over the steam, reluctant to admit how much they wished for more. There was no shame in asking for seconds, though often the pot was too empty to oblige. Picture the castle hall now. The servants arrive, bowls in hand, ladling out portions from the steaming pot. Wooden spoons clatter against the rims, and voices murmur thanks under their breath. For the poor, pottage was more than food, it was warmth, comfort, and even medicine. Chroniclers describe versions laced with herbs like sage or parsley, believed to drive away chills or soothe coughs. To sip such broth on a frosty night was to imagine, if only briefly, that health and spring might return. An offbeat detail tucked into culinary notes of the era is the notion that pottage could be endlessly renewed. Cooks sometimes claimed a pot had simmered for weeks, constantly replenished. Whether true or exaggerated, the image captures the reality. Food was not served in clean, distinct meals, but in continuous improvisation. Last night's stew became tonight's base, and tomorrow's meal would carry echoes of both. You glance toward the cook, her arms strong from lifting ladles, her face smudged with soot. She wipes her brow with her sleeve, tastes the broth, and frowns. Too thin. She reaches for a sack of barley, sprinkles in a handful, and stirs. The bubbling resumes, thickening slowly, and she nods in satisfaction. That is castle survival in miniature. Never perfect, but always enough to scrape through. The fire beneath the cauldron crackles, filling the hall with warmth. Children press closer, rubbing their hands near the flames, their eyes bright with anticipation. A knight stomps in from the cold, his armor clanking, and sighs with relief as a servant thrusts a bowl into his hands. He doesn't complain about the lack of meat or the monotony of taste. After hours on the battlements, even a thin broth feels like feasting. Experts have yet to reach consensus regarding whether these cauldrons acted as social equalizers. Some argue the shared nature of the dish broke down divisions, everyone ate from the same pot. Others contend that even here hierarchy intruded, with the lord's portion scooped from the richer top, while servants scraped the watery bottom. Both possibilities feel true, depending on the night and the household. Still, the image of pottage lingers as one of medieval resilience. It is a dish of patience, of resourcefulness, of survival in its most practical form. The clatter of spoons, the hiss of steam, the dull comfort of hot barley on the tongue, all of it told you that, for tonight at least, hunger was held at bay. Now imagine yourself with your own bowl. The wooden spoon feels rough in your hand, the broth scalds your lips, and the taste is simple, almost bland. Yet as it slips down your throat, spreading warmth to your chest and belly, you close your eyes and let the night feel a little less cruel. Outside, the wind roars against the towers, but inside, in this circle of firelight and bubbling stew, you are safe. And tomorrow? The cauldron will still be here, bubbling again, gathering new scraps, offering the same comfort. In a world where so much was uncertain, the continuity of pottage was its own quiet blessing. The hall quiets after bowls of pottage are cleared away, but thirst remains. You glance around and notice something curious. No one pours plain water. Jugs, pitchers, and casks are filled with ale, weak, cloudy, and endlessly flowing. In a medieval castle, ale wasn't an indulgence. It was survival itself, especially on the coldest nights of the year when warm liquids could mean the difference between comfort and misery. Contemporary chronicles describe how ale was brewed daily in many castles, often in large batches that varied wildly in strength. The common drink was small ale, a brew with just enough alcohol to make it safe from the bacteria that lingered in well water. Imagine taking a sip. It's slightly sour, faintly grainy, with a foamy top that leaves your lips sticky. It doesn't intoxicate, but it hydrates without making you sick, a crucial detail in a world without clean water pipes. One oddity recorded in household rolls is that even children drank ale regularly. You picture a small boy clutching a wooden cup with both hands, sipping carefully so he doesn't spill, while his parents nod approvingly. To modern ears, it sounds scandalous. But in the draughty stone chambers of a castle, where contaminated water could kill, small ale was as harmless as milk. Some experts maintain that brewing was a constant, almost daily task for the women of the household, while others suggest larger castles had entire teams dedicated to it. The truth likely depended on scale. In smaller manors, wives and servants stirred the mash themselves, while in mighty fortresses, brew houses churned with activity, smoke curling from their chimneys in winter air. Scholars still haven't pinned down the exact production rhythms, but the sheer quantity needed tells its own story. Gallons upon gallons, flowing through the lips of every person within these walls. The process itself filled the air with aroma. Barley malt boiled in cauldrons, hops or, before their wide use, herbs like gruit added for flavour. The mash steamed, and the smell of sweet grains spread through the corridors. On cold nights, that steam was its own kind of comfort. Imagine the warmth of a brewing room, compared to the chill of the courtyard, the wooden casks lined up like silent sentinels waiting to be tapped. And tap them they did. A knight trudging in from a freezing watch would slam his gauntleted hand on the table, demanding ale. A maidservant, weary from carrying platters, would sneak a quick gulp in the shadows. Even the cook, after tasting endless pottage, would lift a jug to her lips with a sigh. The ritual repeated endlessly. Pour, drink, swallow, breathe. An offbeat anecdote from a medieval ledger tells of a brewhouse fire that broke out when overheated mash boiled over into flames. The servants rushed not to save the building but to rescue the half-finished ale, scooping it into buckets as though it were treasure. Perhaps it wasn't entirely superstition. Losing a batch meant losing sustenance, and on a freezing January night, the loss felt catastrophic. Was ale truly nutritious? Some academics continue to debate the point. Certain sources insist that small ale carried enough calories to matter, particularly when grain was scarce. Others argue it was simply hydration with a trace of alcohol. Either way, the psychological effect mattered as much as the physical. To sip warm ale by firelight was to feel, for a moment, that you belonged to a community surviving together. Now, imagine the scene in the great hall. The lord lifts a goblet, filled not with small ale but with something stronger, perhaps a spiced brew imported at great expense. The cup glints in the candlelight, the fragrance richer than what his retainers drink. Down the table, soldiers and servants hold rough mugs of the weaker stuff, clinking them together in camaraderie. It isn't equality, but it is connection. Everyone drinks, everyone warms their throat against the cold. You cradle your own mug, feel the rough wood pressing into your palm, and lift it to your lips. The taste is yeasty, faintly bitter, yet oddly soothing. It doesn't dazzle the senses, but it reminds you that you are alive, and that life, however simple, has its pleasures. You can almost hear the fire crackling louder, feel the warmth seeping deeper into your bones as the ale spreads through you. Another curious glimpse comes from records of ale feasts, where fresh batches were celebrated with singing and laughter. On those nights, ale was more than sustenance. It was social glue, an excuse to huddle closer, to forget the draught slipping under the doors. Think of the songs echoing against the vaulted ceiling, mugs raised high, steam rising with the voices, even as the night outside froze solid. But the danger of excess lurked, too. Contemporary complaints survive of guards drinking too much strong ale, falling asleep on their posts, leaving gates vulnerable. Warnings appear in chronicles. Too much ale made a knight sluggish. Too much ale made a servant clumsy. Still, the warnings were rarely heeded, because on nights when the cold howled through the castle walls, the warmth of ale felt worth the risk. Picture it now. The long tables emptying after supper, mugs left half full, foam drying on their rims. A servant gathers them, stacks them, and refills a cask for tomorrow. The smell lingers in the air, mingling with smoke, meat fat, and breadcrumbs. Outside, the snow drifts high against the walls, but inside, the memory of ale remains, cushioning the hunger, softening the night. And so, ale was not merely drink, it was a constant companion. an invisible thread running through every hour of castle life. You sip again, set down your mug, and lean back. The cold is still there, biting at your toes, but for a fleeting moment you feel warmed, fortified, almost content. The echoes of clinking mugs fade into the draughty quiet of the great hall, and soon your gaze turns toward the cellar where another treasure waits. Wheels of cheese, wrapped in cloth and rubbed with salt, sit stacked like squat sentinels against the winter hunger. If salted meat and coarse bread kept bodies alive, it was cheese that offered variety and a faint comfort of richness during the bleakest nights. Inventories from castle accounts often note cheese by weight, sometimes listing entire stones' worth reserved for winter. You picture the steward's careful hand as he tallies each wheel, frowning at the dwindling supply. Unlike soft cheeses of today, most medieval varieties were firm, sharp, and designed to last months in cool storage. They were food, but they were also strategy calories locked safely away until needed. One unexpected glimpse from a manor roll reveals that cheese was frequently doled out as payment to servants or labourers. Imagine receiving a hunk of aged cheddar-like curd as your weekly wage. It might not seem glamorous, but in a frozen castle where every bite mattered, it was nearly as valuable as coin. There remains disagreement among food historians about how widely different cheese types were available. Some argue that peasants relied mostly on simple, fresh curds, while the wealthy enjoyed access to imported or spiced wheels. Others suggest the line blurred, with hard, salted cheeses reaching all ranks during famine years. The lack of consensus only underscores how essential this food was, crossing boundaries of class when winter closed in. You reach out to touch one of the wheels resting in the cellar. The rind is rough beneath your palm, faintly oily, with the tang of fermentation sharp in the nose. Candlelight glimmers off its curve, and you imagine the flavour nutty, salty, almost gritty on the tongue. Not a luxury by modern standards, yet on a bitter night, such richness feels like feasting. A curious anecdote tucked in a 15th century household account tells of cheese being melted into pottage or stirred into eggs for the noble table. But lower down the hall, servants might shave off slivers to sprinkle over their stale bread, transforming monotony into indulgence. You can almost see the satisfaction on their faces, the crust softening beneath a smear of cheese, the flavour clinging to their lips as they lick them clean. Scholars continue to discuss whether monasteries or castles produced the greater share of cheese. Monks certainly perfected the craft, storing wheels in their cool cloisters, while castle kitchens often learned from those methods. The debate remains, but what is clear is that when the snow piled high and roads were impassable, the wheels kept hunger at bay long after fresh milk had vanished. Now envision the dairy stores in mid-January. The air is biting, but the smell is unmistakable. Sharp, tangy, almost pungent, lingering around the shelves. Servants shuffle in with knives, carving portions with care. A boy sneaks a slice, winces at the saltiness, then grins when the richness spreads across his tongue. His cheeks flush, not from the cold, but from the fleeting joy of taste. In the great hall, cheese appears in small amounts on trenchers or added to pies. The Lord's platter glows under the flicker of candlelight, cubes of cheese arranged beside dried fruit. Down the table, a soldier breaks his portion in half to share with a friend, both of them chewing slowly, making the flavour last as long as possible. In the shadowed corner, a servant licks crumbs from her fingers, smiling faintly in spite of the hunger pressing on her ribs. An odd little custom recorded in folklore tells of keeping the last wedge of cheese hidden in a chest until Candlemas, a symbol of endurance through the worst of winter. Whether fact or fancy, it speaks to the emotional power food held, not just filling stomachs, but anchoring hope. To unwrap that wedge in February was to declare, silently, that the household had survived. You lean back against the cellar wall, the chill seeping into your cloak. Above, you hear faint echoes of laughter from the hall, the sound of mugs thumping again, perhaps another toast with ale. But here, among the cheese wheels, survival feels tangible. Each round is a promise that hunger can be delayed, that warmth might return before famine truly bites. And so the wheels remain, stacked patiently, waiting for knives to carve into them one slice at a time. You imagine the relief of each portion, the gratitude, the way a simple sliver of salted curd could make the long night feel just a little shorter. The footsteps of servants echo as you leave the dairy cellar and make your way toward another set of storerooms. Here the air is cooler still, heavy with the smell of earth, and faintly sweet with the breath of sleeping vegetables. For in the depths of winter, when fresh greens had long disappeared from the fields, it was onions, leeks, and turnips that carried castle folk through the darkest nights. Chronicles of provisioning accounts consistently note sacks of root vegetables stored in underground chambers. These sturdy plants, grown through the summer and harvested in autumn, could last for months if kept dry and cool. You picture them piled high in wicker baskets, the leeks bundled together, onions strung in long braids, turnips resting in heaps of dirt to keep them from shriveling. They were not glamorous foods, but they were reliable, and reliability was survival. An oddity preserved in a household roll tells us that onions sometimes doubled as currency, traded for services, or even recorded as part of rent. Imagine offering a string of pungent bulbs in payment your neighbor accepts with gratitude, because in January, such staples were worth far more than shiny coins that couldn't be eaten. Specialists continue to wrestle with the question of just how varied medieval vegetable diets were. Some argue the nobility rarely touched turnips or leeks, leaving them for peasants, while others suggest even lords welcomed them in stews during lean times. The debate remains unresolved, but what is certain is that on a night when snow blanketed the fields, everyone, high and low, looked to these roots for sustenance. You kneel beside a basket of onions and brush your hand across their papery skins. The crackle is sharp, the smell rising immediately, stinging your eyes even before a knife touches them. Imagine a cook dicing them into a cauldron of pottage, the sweetness slowly released as they sizzle in dripping. The hall fills with fragrance strong, familiar, comforting, and for a moment, the cold seems less cruel. Leeks were cherished for their hardiness. You see them chopped into sections, the white stalks clean and crisp, the green tops curling. Tossed into broth, they soften into silk, adding depth to otherwise thin stews. Some records even note leeks being mashed with cheese for a noble's dish, a reminder that what peasants survived on could be refined into delicacy with the right touch. Turnips, meanwhile, were the quiet workhorses. Their flavour was mild, their flesh pale and firm. Boiled, roasted, or sliced into pies, they offered bulk when bread was scarce. A curious little detail from folklore says turnips were sometimes hollowed out, stuffed with spiced mixtures, and served as a sort of medieval treat. Whether common or rare, it paints a vivid picture of creativity in the face of repetition. Some academics argue about whether these root vegetables were considered humble or essential. One side insists they carried the stigma of peasant food, while another notes how often they appear in castle accounts, even at noble tables. Perhaps the truth lies in perception. When the cold was fiercest, nobody turned down a steaming dish of stewed leeks or roasted turnips, no matter their rank. Now picture the kitchen again. A servant trudges in, cheeks red from the cold, carrying a basket of leeks on one hip and a string of onions over his shoulder. He sets them down by the chopping block, blows on his fingers, and begins peeling. Skins curl on the floor, sharp smells sting the air, knives thump rhythmically. The great pot swallows it all, and slowly the thin broth thickens with flavour. At the high table, the lord receives a pie filled with turnips and onions, glazed with butter and sprinkled with herbs. He cuts a slice, the steam curling upward, and nods approvingly. Down the table, servants receive bowls of the same vegetables in plainer form, boiled, salted, perhaps flavoured with a bit of dripping. The taste is simpler, but the nourishment is the same. An amusing tidbit survives in a medieval herbal that claims onions heat the body and stir the blood. Whether true or not, You can imagine the comfort of believing it on a freezing night. To bite into a hot, pungent bulb and feel warmth spread inside, you must have seemed like proof enough. The wind rattles the shutters again, and you imagine the vegetables stored deep below, steady as stone, waiting their turn in the pot. They may not dazzle the palate, but they carry a household quietly from one week to the next. In a season when luxury foods dwindled, these roots and bulbs became lifelines, anchors against famine. You scoop up a piece of roasted turnip, its edges caramelized, its center soft and steaming. The flavor is humble, earthy, a little sweet. You chew slowly, feeling strength return, your belly settling. Around you the hall hums with similar satisfaction. No one is feasting, but no one is starving either. And in a castle winter, that alone was victory. So, onions, leeks, and turnips may not sparkle like spice or dazzle like roasted venison, yet they endured. They fed bodies, calmed fears, and marked the slow passage of nights until spring's green shoots would appear again. In their quiet way, they were the true heroes of the pantry, unseen but indispensable. The air in the hall feels heavy with smoke, bread, and broth, but tonight something unusual wafts from the Lord's high table. It is sharper, more exotic, almost fiery, a pinch of spice stirred into a dish, a fleeting sensation of warmth that seems to ignite the senses even before it touches the tongue. In the middle of winter, when everything tasted of salt and starch, spices were not just flavor, they were fire itself, a taste of far-off lands carried into the frostbitten stone of the castle. Contemporary records of trade show how cinnamon, pepper, and cloves travelled thousands of miles, packed into ships' holds and overland caravans, changing hands again and again before arriving in Europe. To sprinkle even a dusting of these onto food was to spend extravagantly. A dish seasoned with cloves might cost as much as a month's wages for a servant. Imagine the awe and envy in the hall when the Lord's trencher steamed with such fragrance. One unexpected glimpse comes from a surviving banquet account noting powder of ginger, used in small quantities to season pottage. Not enough to overwhelm, but just enough to add a tingle that tricked the body into feeling warmer. On a night when snow hammered at the shutters, such a sensation was as much psychological as culinary. There is ongoing discussion in historical circles about how frequently spices were actually used in everyday castle meals. Some scholars argue they appeared only on great feasts, to impress guests with wealth. Others suggest they crept into kitchens more often, in subtle pinches, to mask the sourness of salted meat or the mustiness of stale grain. Both views carry weight, and perhaps the truth was as varied as the households themselves. Picture the great hall again. At the Lord's table, a platter of roasted fowl gleams in the candlelight, its skin brushed with honey and dusted with saffron. The golden hue dazzles the eye, and the aroma carries down the table. Servants pause mid-chew, noses twitching, eyes darting toward the sauce. Their own bowls hold plain broth and bread, but for a fleeting moment, the fragrance makes them imagine richer flavors on their tongues. A curious note from medieval cookbooks reveals that pepper was the most prized of all, not just because of its flavor, but because it was measurable and tradable, worth its weight in silver in some ports. A pouch of peppercorns could ransom a prisoner or seal a political bargain. You imagine a steward locking such spices in a chest, counting the grains as carefully as coins. In winter, when meals grew monotonous, the temptation to reach into that chest must have been immense. And then there is saffron. Thin red threads, delicate and costly, sometimes valued more than gold. When added to a dish, it turns stews luminous yellow, dazzling to eyes weary of pale grains and brown bread. Did it really warm the body, as physicians claimed? Opinions differ. Some medical texts swore it lifted spirits and drove away chill, while others warned of excess. But you can easily picture the relief of watching your dull pottage glow golden, as though summer had returned for a spoonful or two. In the kitchens, the cook sprinkles a pinch of spice into a bubbling pot, stirs, tastes, and smiles faintly. The steam that rises now is transformed, sharper, richer, layered. A scullion leans close, inhales, and sighs. He will not taste this version. The Lord's pot is separate, but even the scent lingers in his nose, warming him as he returns to scrub dishes in cold water. Specialists have yet to reach consensus on whether spices truly mask the taste of spoiled meat. Some argue this was their chief role, covering rancid flavors with exotic heat. Others insist that nobles valued freshness and would never tolerate spoiled food, using spices instead as symbols of wealth and status. Perhaps, as often in history, both were true. Spices dazzled on feast days, but also quietly rescued a barrel of meat when winter's dampness worked its rot. An odd little tale survives of a servant caught stealing a handful of cloves from the pantry. His punishment was severe, not because of the theft itself, but because those tiny buds represented a fortune. To steal a clove was to steal prestige, comfort, and warmth from the entire household. You imagine his trembling hands, the scent of cloves still clinging to his fingertips as he begged forgiveness. Now envision the hall on a bitter January night. The wind shrieks beyond the walls, but inside, the nobles lean over plates glowing with saffron, spiced sauces dribbling across roasted meats. Down the benches, the lower household gnaws bread and onion, their mouths watering at the scent drifting their way. The hierarchy is palpable, drawn not just in clothing or seating but in taste. Spice divides as much as it delights. Still, every once in a while, a scrap trickles down. A trencher soaked with spiced sauce is tossed aside, and a servant catches it eagerly. For him, that single bite carries not only warmth, but a taste of faraway lands he will never see. The spice speaks of deserts, caravans, and ports, of worlds beyond the icy walls of the castle. In that instant, he is not just surviving winter, he is tasting adventure. You sip from your own trencher now. Imagine the faint heat of pepper dancing on your tongue. It isn't much, but it lingers, a glow that spreads through your chest. The candlelight seems brighter, the draught less cruel. Spices were never meant to fill bellies, they couldn't compete with bread or cheese, but they fed something equally essential, the spirit. So in these castles during the coldest nights, spices were sparks in the gloom, fleeting, extravagant, but unforgettable. They lit up meals the way fire lit up the hearth, reminding all who tasted them that winter, however long, could still hold moments of warmth and wonder. The glow of saffron-yellow stews and pepper-spiced roasts fades as you let your gaze drift from the Lord's high table down the length of the hall. Here, at the far end, where the draughts creep in under the doors and candlelight dims, another story unfolds. This is the story of contrast, of abundance gleaming under silver platters for the noble family, and of scraps, crusts, and watery broth for the servants, soldiers, and kitchen drudges who keep the castle alive. Contemporary accounts in household records consistently note a sharp divide in provisions. The high-born ate the white bread of fine wheat, the blancmange of rice and almond milk, and the roasted meats seasoned with costly spices. Everyone else, meanwhile, filled their bellies with maslin bread of mixed grains, onions, cabbage, or thin pottage stretched until the last ladle scraped the pot. The divide was not hidden, it was on full display, visible every night in the seating arrangements, the dishes, even the quality of tableware. An unexpected glimpse from a surviving kitchen ledger shows the difference in portions. One goose might be allotted to the Lord and his family alone, while its dripping the fat and juices collected during roasting was poured over bread for the servants. To the hungry, that greasy slice was treasure. You can almost feel the way they licked their fingers afterward, savouring the richness that the nobles barely noticed. There remains debate among scholars about how rigidly this food hierarchy was enforced. Some argue that lords occasionally invited favoured retainers to share richer fare, blurring the lines. Others insist the distinction was nearly absolute, a daily reminder of social rank. The truth likely depended on the personality of the lord and the severity of the winter. Generosity might loosen during feast days, but when famine pressed close, divisions hardened like ice. Imagine the sounds in the hall as supper begins. At the high table, knives clink against pewter, goblets of imported wine catch the candlelight, and laughter rises easily. Further down, the benches creak under the weight of guards and servants. Their bowls are wooden, their spoons plain. They hunch over their meals, eating quickly before the thin broth cools. A child drops a hunk of bread into his bowl to soak up every last drop. His father nudges him, urging him to eat slowly, make it last. An odd little detail emerges from chronicles of large banquets. Once nobles had finished, the remains, the trenchers soaked in gravy, the bones with bits of meat still clinging were sometimes collected for the poor outside the castle gates. It sounds charitable, yet you realize what it really means. The difference between nobility and peasantry could be measured in leftovers. To receive a trencher stained with sauce was to taste, indirectly, the luxury enjoyed by others. Specialists still argue whether servants truly resented these divisions, or whether the starkness of medieval hierarchy made it feel natural, even inevitable. Some point to records of grumbling, where soldiers complained of thin rations, while others note the loyalty of retainers who endured despite scarcity. Perhaps it was both. Envy simmered quietly in the belly, even as obedience ruled the outward gesture. Picture yourself walking along the hall now. At one end, the noble family leans back, satisfied, wiping their lips with cloth napkins. A roasted swan, its feathers redressed and gilded, sits half-picked on a platter. At the other end, a guard gnaws a turnip, his teeth grinding the fibrous flesh, his eyes darting toward the high table. He doesn't speak the thought aloud, but you can see it written on his face. Two worlds, divided by little more than a line of trestle tables. A curious anecdote tucked into an English household account tells of kitchen boys stealing from the dripping pan those pools of fat that collected beneath roasting spits. They were caught, scolded, sometimes beaten, yet the temptation was too great. Dripping transformed hard bread into luxury, and hunger has always had sticky fingers. You imagine their hearts pounding as they snatched a quick taste, then hurried back to their chores with grease still shining on their lips. And yet, despite the inequality, there was a rhythm to it all that kept the household functioning. Everyone knew their place. The lord displayed his wealth through food, the servants endured on scraps, and together the system held. On holy days or great feasts, the boundaries sometimes softened. Extra portions might trickle down, a trencher of meat might be shared, and for one night the cold stone of hierarchy seemed less unyielding. But when the winter pressed hardest, the division grew sharper. Imagine a February night when the storerooms were nearly bare. The lord's family still received meat and cheese, while the servants slurped watery cabbage soup. Resentment lingered in the shadows, but survival demanded silence. To complain too loudly was to risk dismissal, or worse, starvation outside the castle walls. You sit now at the lower end of the hall, a rough wooden bowl in front of you. Inside is little more than pottage, flavoured with a sliver of onion and a crust of bread gone soft. The steam warms your face, and you clutch the bowl as though it were treasure. At the far end, laughter echoes. A roast is carved, goblets clink. You close your eyes, inhale deeply, and eat what you have. Hunger does not wait for fairness. So the castle on winter nights was not just a fortress of stone, it was a fortress of contrasts, lavish at one end, meagre at the other, yet bound together by the same cold walls and the same roaring wind outside. Food told the truth no words dared to say, here is power, and here is survival. The smell of roasted fowl and spiced sauces lingers faintly in the hall long after the feast ends. Yet, when you step into the cold passageways beyond the firelight, another truth emerges. Meat was elusive, and on the coldest nights it was rationed with painful care. Venison, pork, and mutton were the staples, but they were not bottomless supplies. Hunting grounds froze, herds grew thin, and the distance between craving and reality widened with every passing week of winter. Contemporary inventories consistently list salted pork and preserved mutton as the backbone of castle diets. Great slabs of it were packed into barrels, salted until the flesh stiffened. When fresh meat was scarce, these barrels were tapped carefully, their contents rationed one joint at a time. The lord might enjoy a haunch of venison roasted over an open fire, but the servants, guards, and kitchen scullions received little more than the broth boiled from the bones. A curious detail tucked into the household accounts of a 14th century castle notes that venison was so valuable that entire hunts were arranged purely to refill larders for winter. Imagine a party of hunters wrapped in furs, riding through frosty woods, hounds baying in the snow. The catch, a stag brought down after hours of chase, was carried triumphantly to the castle. Yet the triumph was short-lived. Much of the venison was salted immediately, destined not for feasting but for storage, to stretch across long weeks when the woods offered nothing. Some historians argue that pork was the true winter meat, easier to raise and preserve, while venison remained a luxury item for show. Others counter that hunting was central to noble identity, making venison as much a social necessity as it was a meal. The debate continues. But the evidence is clear. When the snow fell thick, it was not abundance but scarcity that ruled, and every cut of meat became a calculation. Now picture the castle kitchens on such a night. The spits turn slowly, dripping fat onto pans below. The smell of roasting pork spreads across the hall, but the portions are smaller than you expect. The lord's platter receives thick slices, seared and glistening, while the guards at the lower table gnaw at thinner scraps. A child licks the bone until nothing remains, and then chews the marrow, eyes closed in concentration. For him, even the bone is a prize. An unusual anecdote survives from the writings of a monastic chronicler. One winter, the meat ran so short that a household resorted to boiling hides, scraps of leather softened into a bitter broth. Whether exaggerated or true, it reflects the desperation that hunger could inspire. Picture the taste. Acrid, tough, hardly food at all, yet still swallowed with the hope of staving off starvation. The preservation of meat was its own precarious art. Barrels of salted beef might sour if the brine grew weak. Smoked hams could mould if damp crept in. Stewards fretted constantly, checking casks, turning cuts, scraping away suspicious spots. A single spoiled barrel meant not just waste, but danger. Illness lurked in spoiled meat, and in a world already weakened by cold, such illness spread fast. Experts remained divided over whether spices were primarily used to mask such spoilage or simply to flaunt wealth. Some maintain that pepper and cloves disguised the tang of meat gone slightly bad, while others insist nobles would never tolerate such risk. Perhaps both are true. A pinch of spice might brighten a tough slice, or, more grimly, render it palatable enough to eat. Step now into the great hall on a February evening. The tables are set, the dishes carried out. A roast boar's head, adorned with apples and gilded tusks, makes its way to the lord's table. It is more spectacle than sustenance, a symbol of grandeur in the midst of scarcity. Further down, soldiers receive boiled mutton, grey and stringy, ladled into bowls with thin broth. They eat quickly, silently, grateful yet unsatisfied. Another curious tidbit lies in folklore. Some castles believed that the first slice of meat carved at the high table held protective power. Servants whispered that eating it would bring luck through the rest of winter. Whether true or not, such beliefs reveal how precious each portion was. Meat wasn't just food, it was reassurance, a talisman against the gnawing fear of famine. You take a bite in your imagination now. The slice is salty, tough from preservation, but the fat melts slightly on your tongue. For a moment, you savor the richness, your belly sighing in relief. Yet as soon as it is gone, you crave more, and the emptiness creeps back in. That was the cruel rhythm of meat in a medieval castle. Treasured, fleeting, never enough. The fires crackle, the bones are stripped, and soon only the scent remains. Servants gather the leftovers, boiling bones for tomorrow's pottage, scraping fat into jars for dripping. Nothing is wasted. for nothing can be spared. Outside, the wolves howl beyond the frozen woods, hungry themselves. Inside, hunger is quieter but no less fierce, pacing the hall like an invisible beast. So, on the coldest nights, meat was both prize and memory, something to stretch, to ration, to dream of, even when your plate held none. It fed not only the body but also the imagination, reminding everyone that spring might return, and with it, the hunt, the herds, the taste of plenty once more. The candles flicker low in the hall, and the remains of salted pork and venison bones are cleared away. But not every night could be marked with meat, and in fact, many nights were deliberately stripped of it. For the rhythm of life in a medieval castle was bound not only to the seasons, but also to the calendar of the church, and that calendar was relentless. It told you when to feast, when to fast, and when in the dead of winter your bowl would hold fish instead of meat. Ecclesiastical rules demanded abstinence from flesh on Fridays, on the vigils of holy days, and for long stretches of Lent and Advent. Imagine the frustration. On the coldest nights, when your body begged for the heaviness of pork fat, the cook was instead boiling salted herring. A knight stomps into the hall after a bitter watch on the battlements, armor iced over, belly aching, and what greets him? A slab of fish so dry it nearly crumbles in his hand. Household accounts consistently show vast purchases of salted or dried fish, sometimes brought from distant coasts, sometimes from rivers nearby. Barrels of cod, herring, or eels lined castle cellars, stacked beside the salted pork, waiting for their mandated nights. The smell was pungent, sharp enough to sting the nose. Imagine walking past the stores, the brine dripping onto the stone floor, the odor of the sea haunting even a landlocked fortress. An offbeat glimpse in a French ledger notes that fish days were sometimes dreaded so much that cooks disguised the dishes with sauces made from almond milk, vinegar, or even spices, trying to trick the palate into thinking it was meat. You picture a steaming platter of pike drenched in saffron sauce, the lord nodding with approval, while servants whispered behind their hands, "It still tastes like fish." There remains disagreement among historians about just how strictly these fasting rules were observed. Some argue that nobles bent the rules, claiming beavers counted as fish because they lived in water, or feasting on barnacle geese, which were bizarrely thought to hatch from driftwood and therefore escaped the ban. Others insist the rules were followed closely, enforced by priests who knew exactly when meat appeared in kitchens and when it should not. The truth may have shifted with circumstance. In years of plenty, compliance came easily, while in years of scarcity, lines blurred in the shadows. Picture the hall on a Friday evening in January. The tables are quieter, the dishes plainer. Salt fish is boiled, its flesh flaking apart, and served with onions or turnips to soften the monotony. Servants chew dutifully, guards sigh into their bowls. At the high table, the lord swallows a bite of fish pie, seasoned with pepper to disguise the saltiness. He does not complain, it is penance, after all, but his eyes drift toward the memory of venison. An odd little note from medieval chronicles tells of elaborate fish sculptures carved from dough and set on noble tables during Lent. They were meant to impress guests, to make a fast day meal feel less meagre. Imagine the irony. Artistry lavished on a dish that still carried the tang of brine. The servants, watching from the sidelines, rolled their eyes but envied even that display, for their own plates held nothing so decorative. Experts continue to puzzle over whether the fasting calendar actually increased the demand for fish trade across Europe. Some suggest it created booming markets for herring and cod, fueling entire economies. Others argue that local rivers and ponds supplied more than enough, making the grand trade routes less crucial. What is certain is that, on the coldest nights of the year, the fish barrel was as vital as the salt meat cask, and perhaps even more frequently tapped. You sip from a wooden bowl of fish stew now, the broth thin but hot, flavored with leeks and vinegar. The smell is sharp, the taste briny. It is not satisfying, not like pork fat sizzling over a fire, but it fills your belly. Around you, the hall murmurs with quiet discontent. Everyone eats, but no one smiles. Hunger makes fish tolerable. Faith makes it necessary. Yet the rhythms of fasting and feasting brought a strange balance. The denial of meat made the return of it feel more luxurious. After weeks of salted herring, the taste of roasted mutton became ecstasy. And perhaps that was part of the design, to make people hunger not just for food, but for the return of joy. The candles sputter, the prayers are mumbled, and the hall sinks into silence. Outside, the snow presses hard against the walls. Inside, fish bones are gathered, scraps tossed into the pottage pot for tomorrow. You lie back, your belly warm but unsatisfied, and you realize the castle's diet was as much about obedience as it was about survival. So, in the heart of winter, food was shaped not only by nature's scarcity, but by the church's rules. Fish days and fasting nights carved deep grooves in the rhythm of castle life, reminding everyone from lord to scullion that no hunger, no matter how sharp, could ignore the voice of faith. The echo of the evening prayer still lingers in the chill air of the hall. Trenches have been cleared, fish bones carted away, and the torches along the walls burn low. Yet one food rarely seen on these long winter nights hovers in people's minds: eggs. Simple, fragile, endlessly useful, but in January or February, eggs were as rare as warm sunshine. Medieval household accounts repeatedly show that egg supplies dwindled drastically in winter. Hens, sensitive to daylight, laid little if anything during the darkest months. Imagine walking into the poultry yard. The birds huddled together for warmth, their feathers fluffed, their combs pale from the cold. You search the straw in their nesting boxes and find nothing but frozen droppings. An egg, when it appeared, was almost a miracle. A curious entry in a 14th century castle roll describes eggs being imported at great cost from nearby villages during midwinter, carried carefully in baskets padded with hay. Servants who delivered them treated the fragile shells like treasure, aware that one crack could waste food worth far more than its size. Picture the relief in a noble kitchen when such a basket arrived, a sudden wealth of possibility in the cook's hands. Some experts argue that nobles hoarded eggs almost entirely for the lord's table, reserving them for custards, pies, or sauces. Others counter that stews for servants sometimes incorporated beaten eggs to thicken broth, suggesting that, though rare, they occasionally trickled down to the lower benches. The debate continues, but the scarcity itself is undisputed. Eggs were winter's rarest gems. Now picture the kitchen on a bitter February evening. The cook cracks one egg into a bowl, and all the scullions pause to watch, as though she had broken open a jewel. She stirs it into a pot of hot almond milk, whisking quickly until the mixture thickens into a custard. The golden steam rises, filling the air with a fragrance so different from salted fish or onions that everyone inhales deeply, hoping for a taste. Only a few spoons will reach the lord's table, but even the smell is intoxicating. An amusing anecdote from a medieval household manual claims that cooks sometimes preserved eggs by coating them in wax or ash, stretching their shelf life for months. Whether this was widely practiced is uncertain, but you can imagine the surprise of finding a half-dozen eggs in January, carefully sealed and hidden away, like secrets waiting to be revealed. Specialists continue to wrestle with the question of how eggs fit into fasting rules. On some days they were permitted, on others, strictly forbidden, classified as animal flesh. This inconsistency must have been maddening for cooks, who were forced to juggle not only scarcity but also doctrine. Imagine the confusion in the kitchen. The priest insists eggs are banned, the steward waves a household role that suggests otherwise, and the cook, exasperated, sets the eggs aside until someone decides. For those lucky enough to taste them, eggs brought variety. Hard-boiled and sliced over bread, whipped into sauces, or baked into pies with cheese, they transformed simple meals into something memorable. A single egg could stretch an entire dish, binding ingredients together, thickening stews, or adding a touch of richness where none existed. Picture the hall on one such night. The Lord receives a pie glazed with beaten egg, its crust shining golden in the candlelight. He slices into it, steam curling upward, and nods in approval. Down the table, a servant gnaws on dark bread, glancing enviously at the gleaming crust. The difference between the two plates is not just taste, it is light itself. The egg glows with the promise of spring, while the servant's bread remains dull, heavy, unyielding. A curious superstition recorded in folklore says that eating the first egg laid after Christmas brought luck for the household. Perhaps it was symbolic, proof that even in the depths of winter, life continued, fragile yet persistent. Imagine a steward cradling such an egg carefully, presenting it with solemnity, and the cook deciding whether to boil it, bake it, or simply keep it whole as a talisman. You lift an egg in your hand now. Feel its smooth, cold shell. It seems impossibly delicate compared to the rough bread and salted meat that dominate winter meals. And yet, within it lies richness, yolk golden as sunlight, white clear as ice, both waiting to nourish. You imagine cracking it into a pan, hearing the sizzle, smelling the warmth. In that moment, you understand why eggs were coveted, hoarded, argued over. They were small, but they were everything. So, during the coldest nights in medieval castles, eggs were both absence and dream, rare enough to spark envy, precious enough to divide the hall, versatile enough to transform a meal. They reminded everyone, lord and servant alike, that spring would return, hens would lay again, and abundance might yet follow famine. Until then, the memory of their taste was enough to keep hope alive. The hall grows quieter as the night deepens. The last scraps of salted fish and fragments of bread have been cleared. Yet in the corners of the kitchen, another kind of food gleams faintly in the candlelight: sweetness. It is rare, fleeting, and precious. Honey sealed in earthen pots, raisins shriveled but still rich with sugar, figs pressed flat and sticky, dates carried across seas. These were the rare indulgences that could lift spirits when the snow pressed hardest against the castle walls. Inventories from noble households often mention honey as both food and medicine. It sweetened sauces, glazed meats, and preserved fruit, but it was never poured freely as you might drizzle syrup today. Each spoonful was guarded carefully, measured by the steward's hand. You imagine him standing with a ledger, noting down every pot opened, every pound consumed, his quill scratching against parchment, while the cook mutters under her breath. An unexpected glimpse comes from a 15th century banquet description where honey was drizzled over roasted apples, served steaming to the Lord's table in midwinter. The fragrance must have been intoxicating, the sweetness overwhelming after weeks of salt, grain, and broth. Picture yourself biting into such an apple, the skin splitting, the honey running down your chin, and then realize, for the servant watching from the shadows, that bite was unreachable, a dream behind candlelight. Specialists continue to disagree about how widely dried fruits were available. Some argue they were luxuries reserved for feast days, imported through Mediterranean trade routes. Others suggest that raisins and figs, though costly, appeared more often, tucked into storage for winter precisely because they kept so well. The argument lingers, but all sides agree that when such foods appeared, they were sparks of joy in otherwise colourless meals. Imagine the hall on a holy evening, perhaps after a fasting period. Trays appear at the Lord's table, bearing small piles of raisins, almonds, and candied ginger. The nobles lean forward, pinching the treats delicately between their fingers, savouring each chew. Down the benches, servants crane their necks, hoping a few scraps might fall their way. Sometimes they did raisins left on a trencher, or honey scraped from a pot with the back of a spoon. Even a single raisin could feel like treasure in January. An offbeat detail preserved in medical texts is the belief that honey warmed the body and steadied the heart. Physicians recommended it for coughs, chills, even melancholy. A servant, shivering in the dormitory, might dream of a spoonful of honey to soothe his throat, though such medicine was almost always reserved for the Lord's household. Still, the idea that sweetness could heal was powerful, and belief itself carried comfort. Now step into the kitchen, where a cook stirs dried figs into a thick paste, rolling it into balls and dusting them with flour to keep from sticking. She sets them aside for a feast day, but a scullion sneaks one, popping it into his mouth before anyone notices. The burst of sugar is so intense it makes his eyes widen, his lips stick, his heart race. He grins despite the risk, because in that moment he has tasted something close to paradise. Scholars remain divided over whether honey or imported sugar dominated noble diets in winter. Some point to records of sugar loaves arriving from Venice or Genoa, suggesting it was available to the richest. Others argue sugar was too costly for regular use, leaving honey as the primary sweetener. Either way, sweetness was never abundant. It appeared in moments spooned into spiced wine, baked into pies, or drizzled onto cheese. Picture the Lord now, reclining after supper, lifting a goblet of hot mulled wine sweetened with honey and spiced with cinnamon. He sips slowly, savouring the warmth spreading through his chest. At the other end of the hall, a soldier licks the last crumbs of bread from his hand, his eyes heavy with fatigue. He will not taste honey tonight, but the smell drifting down the hall reaches him, and for a heartbeat, that is enough. A curious tidbit from folklore says that bees were thought to carry messages between this world and the divine. To eat honey, then, was to taste something holy. Whether people believed this literally or not, it added weight to the golden sweetness. To dip bread into honey on a frozen night was not merely indulgence, it was communion with warmth, light, and life itself. You hold a dried fig in your hand now, its skin wrinkled, its flesh dense. You bite into it, and the sugar coats your tongue, rich and heavy, almost overwhelming after weeks of bland bread. Your body sighs with relief. Your mind drifts to thoughts of orchards and sunlight. For a moment, winter feels far away. That was the power of sweetness in the medieval castle. It transported you, if only briefly, beyond the frost and the hunger. So on the coldest nights, when hunger was sharpest and meals were plainest, honey and dried fruits offered more than nourishment. They offered memory, hope, and a fleeting taste of joy. They reminded you that not all food was survival, some was delight, and sometimes that delight was the difference between enduring winter and despairing in it. The sweetness of honey lingers on your tongue, but soon the taste fades, replaced again by the steady rhythm of the castle kitchen. The pots bubble, the ovens glow faintly, and once more the most faithful companions of winter meals reassert themselves: oats and barley. If bread was the body of sustenance and meat the dream of plenty, porridge and gruel were the quiet heartbeat of survival. Contemporary accounts of provisioning rolls regularly mention sacks of oats stored in storerooms, stacked high against the stone walls. Oats thrived in the harsher climates of northern Europe, while barley was often more dependable than wheat in poor soils. These grains were cheaper, sturdier, and more filling than most alternatives. Imagine the cook's relief as she reached for a sack of barley when other supplies ran low. It meant she could thicken broth, stretch stew, and, if nothing else, make porridge. One curious glimpse comes from a 13th century household account, noting how porridge was eaten at nearly every meal by servants, sometimes flavoured with onions, sometimes sweetened with a drop of honey if fortune allowed, but usually plain, a bowl of steaming mush, grey and lumpy. Picture a soldier sitting on a bench, spoon in hand, lifting porridge to his lips, blowing to cool it. He doesn't smile, but he doesn't frown either. It fills him, and that is enough. Experts still debate whether porridge was viewed as lowly food or as a staple accepted by all ranks. Some argue that nobles sneered at it, preferring bread and meat, while others point to recipes for barley gruel, enriched with almond milk and saffron, luxurious touches that transformed the humble dish into something worthy of the high table. Perhaps porridge, like so much else, was elastic, meagre in one bowl, magnificent in another, depending on the hands that stirred it. Imagine the hall on a bitter morning. The sun hasn't yet risen, the frost thick on the window slits, and servants gather with bowls of porridge steaming in their hands. The wooden spoons scrape softly, the smell is faintly nutty, and the warmth spreads slowly from the inside out. Children eat eagerly, their lips shining with steam, while adults chew dutifully, aware that porridge will keep them standing through hours of cold labour. An offbeat detail tucked into medieval remedies suggests porridge was sometimes prescribed for ailments. Barley water, thin and bland, was thought to soothe fevers and coughs. You imagine a servant coughing in the dormitory, a companion bringing him a bowl of lukewarm barley water. It doesn't taste of much, but it eases the throat, and perhaps belief in its healing properties makes it work all the more. There is ongoing discussion in historical circles about the consistency of these porridges. Some accounts describe thick, almost solid lumps eaten with knives, while others mention thin, watery gruels sipped from cups. The variety reflected the state of the larder. When grain was plentiful, porridge might be hearty. When grain was scarce, it became little more than cloudy water. Each bowl told its own quiet story of abundance or want. Now picture the kitchens in the evening. A scullion stirs a cauldron of oats with a long wooden paddle, sweat running down his brow despite the cold. The grain thickens slowly, bubbling at the edges, splattering his tunic. He wipes his sleeve across his forehead and keeps stirring, knowing that dozens of bowls must be filled. He is not cooking for pleasure, but for endurance, and when the bowls are ladled out, no one thanks him. Yet every stomach will feel less hollow for his work. A curious anecdote survives of a feast where the Lord, mocking his soldiers, demanded they eat barley porridge at the high table as peasant fare. The soldiers complied, spoons clinking, while the Lord laughed. But in truth, they did not mind. They were used to porridge, they knew its comfort. If anything, the Lord was the one missing out, blind to the humble satisfaction of grain and warmth. Picture yourself with a bowl now. The porridge is thick, slightly lumpy, with the faint scent of smoke from the fire. You scoop a spoonful, taste the earthy sweetness of barley, the grainy chew of oats. It is not delicious, but it spreads warmth down your chest, filling the hollow inside. You lean back, sigh, and let the heat seep into your bones. Outside, the snow presses against the castle walls. Inside, you feel a little stronger. And that was the role of oats and barley in the coldest nights of the year. They did not delight, they did not impress, but they endured. They waited in sacks, ready to be boiled, ready to thicken a pot, ready to silence the growl of a stomach. In their quiet, humble way, they were the fuel that carried the castle through frost and famine alike. So when you imagine the grandeur of medieval feasting, do not forget the porridge. Behind the gilded platters and the roasted swans, behind the banquets with music and laughter, the true sustenance was a bowl of grain, steaming in the hands of a weary servant. It was not glory, but it was survival, and survival was the richest prize of all. The fire in the kitchen spits and crackles as you drift closer to the wooden tables where the cooks work their craft. Amid the salted meats, porridge pots, and root vegetables, another staple of winter life emerges: pies. Not the flaky, buttery pastries you might crave today, but thick-crusted fortresses of dough, built less to delight than to endure. In a castle winter, pies were not simply meals, they were storage devices, edible chests designed to preserve meat and keep it edible for weeks, sometimes months. Records from castle inventories frequently list coffins, the word used for the sturdy pastry cases that encased fillings. These crusts were often made of rye or barley flour, mixed with water into a dense, unyielding dough. The goal was not tenderness but strength, a barrier against air, rot, and insects. Imagine biting into such a crust. The taste would be dry, bland, almost like clay, yet the filling inside, if you were lucky, was rich with meat, spices, or even fruit. One unexpected detail comes from a 15th century English recipe collection, which describes sealing pies with melted fat poured into the crust after baking. This layer hardened, locking out air and keeping the meat moist. It was ingenious, if somewhat unappetizing to modern eyes. Picture the cook pouring ladlefuls of hot tallow into a pie, the liquid hissing as it hit the crust, the servants watching, knowing that this meant the dish would last until February's end. Some historians argue that pies were primarily tools of preservation, rarely eaten in one sitting. Others suggest they doubled as impressive displays, carried whole into the hall and sliced dramatically before guests. The debate remains unresolved, but both views capture truth. Pies were both practical and performative, a bridge between storage and spectacle. Now imagine the hall on a freezing night. A massive pie is brought to the Lord's table, its crust browned, its edges pinched into decorative ridges. When cut open, steam billows out, carrying the scent of venison, rabbit, or even pigeon. The nobles lean forward eagerly, spearing the rich filling with silver knives. Down at the benches, servants receive smaller pies, perhaps filled with turnips or onions instead of meat. But the excitement is the same, a dish that feels whole, enclosed, and generous. An offbeat anecdote preserved in banquet descriptions tells of pies containing surprises, live birds released when the crust was opened, or tiny figurines hidden within as tokens. Such spectacles were rare, of course, but they reveal how pies could dazzle beyond their role as storage. Imagine the gasp of the hall as sparrows flew upward, the laughter echoing under the rafters. Even if the filling was plain, the drama nourished the spirit. Scholars continue to puzzle over how often the crust itself was eaten. Some sources insist it was discarded, too tough to chew. Others argue servants consumed the softened edges once the filling was gone. Perhaps the truth lies in class. For the noble, the crust was a container. For the hungry servant, it was food, no matter how hard. Picture a kitchen boy, gnawing on the cold shell of yesterday's pie, teeth straining, but stomach grateful. Step into the kitchen now. A cook rolls out dough with a wooden pin, her hands dusted in flour. She lines a deep dish, packs in salted pork and onions, then covers it with another sheet of dough. Her fingers pinch the edges tight, sealing the treasure within. She slides it into the oven, and soon the air fills with the smell of baking grain, a smell warmer and more comforting than the taste will ever be. Another curious tidbit from folklore describes pies as symbols of fortune. To give a traveller a meat pie in winter was to wish him safe passage and strength. Perhaps this was practical, a pie could survive the journey, but it also carried meaning, protection wrapped in crust. You can almost see a knight tucking a small pie into his saddlebag before riding out into snow, grateful for the knowledge that a meal waited when hunger gnawed. Picture yourself cutting into such a pie. The crust cracks under your knife, the steam bursts forth, and inside lies the filling, savory, rich, spiced if fortune allows. You take a bite, chew slowly, and close your eyes. The crust is heavy, the filling salty, but together they taste like survival, like certainty in uncertain times. Outside the castle, famine stalks villages. Inside, this pie is proof that the household endures. Experts have yet to reach consensus on whether pies democratized food, since even servants might receive them, or whether they reinforced class, since fillings varied so dramatically by rank. Perhaps both were true. Pies unified the household in form but divided it in substance. At every table, crusts cracked, but what lay inside revealed where you stood. And so the pie was more than food. It was ingenuity against winter, a vessel of hope sealed in dough, a dish that bridged feast and famine. On the coldest nights, as the wind roared around the towers and the snow piled high, the sight of a pie being carried into the hall must have sparked relief, not because it promised delight, but because it promised endurance. The pie crusts cool, the candles burn low, and the hall begins to settle into its nightly rhythm. Yet winter nights in a medieval castle were not meant to be endured in silence. When food was shared, so too was company, and nowhere was that clearer than in the communal feasting that unfolded beneath the shadow of stone vaults and smoking torches. Even when meals were modest pottage, porridge, or a scrap of salted meat, the act of eating together turned bare sustenance into an event of survival and solidarity. Household chronicles consistently describe the architecture of these meals. Long trestle tables, stretching the length of the great hall, benches filled with guards, servants, and retainers, all huddled close in the draughty space. At the far end, the Lord's dais stood slightly raised, his family seated in splendor before a backdrop of tapestries. The hierarchy was etched into the very geometry of the feast: who sat where, who ate what, who was seen, and who was forgotten. An unexpected glimpse comes from an account of a winter feast in northern France, which described candles numbering in the hundreds illuminating the hall. Wax was expensive, and the extravagance of so much light dazzled visitors. Imagine the glow flickering against cold stone, smoke curling upward, shadows leaping across the rafters. The warmth of the fire may not have reached every corner, but the sight of that light, multiplied by the reflection of pewter dishes and polished goblets, must have created the illusion of abundance. Some scholars argue that communal meals were designed as much to reinforce authority as to feed bellies. The Lord sat in state, distributing meat and bread as signs of his generosity. Others maintain that the act of gathering, even for humble stews, built cohesion, shared hardship softened by shared company. Both interpretations ring true. On the coldest nights, hierarchy and fellowship coexisted uneasily, stitched together by the smoke of the same hearth. Picture the sound of such a night: spoons clattering against wooden bowls, voices murmuring prayers, the occasional cough echoing through the rafters. A hound pads across the floor, hoping for scraps. Children giggle, silenced by their mothers. The smells: ale, smoke, cabbage, roasted meat meld into one dense atmosphere, thick enough to cling to clothing for days. It is not glamorous, but it is alive, and in winter, that mattered most. An offbeat detail from feast descriptions tells of minstrels and musicians brought in to perform between courses, even in smaller castles. Their lutes and fiddles threaded music through the smoky air, turning ordinary suppers into spectacles. Imagine the hush falling as a minstrel began to sing of ancient kings, his voice rising above the din, the servants pausing mid-bite to listen, the fire crackling in time with the tune. For a brief moment, hunger faded into wonder. Specialists continue to debate how inclusive these gatherings really were. Some insist that only the inner household joined the Lord in the great hall, while others argue that wider circles, villagers, craftsmen, even beggars might be invited during harsh winters or holy feasts. The lack of consensus reveals how flexible the practice could be, sometimes insular, sometimes expansive, depending on the wealth of the castle and the character of its master. Imagine the table itself: boards set upon trestles, covered with cloth at the high end, bare at the lower. Platters are carried in, steaming, each one placed strategically. The Lord is served first, his family next, then the guests of rank. Only after the upper end is satisfied do the servants and guards receive their portions. It is a cascade of food down the ladder of class, each rung receiving what remains from above. Yet even in such hierarchy, the warmth of togetherness lingered. A guard might raise his mug toward a fellow, their laughter echoing despite the draughts. A maid might sneak a smile at a scullion across the table. Shared hardship built its own bonds, and the clamour of many voices in one hall created a sense of safety. The wolves howling outside the gates seemed distant when 100 spoons rattled in unison against wooden bowls. Another curious anecdote comes from English folklore. It was considered bad luck to eat in complete silence. To share food meant to share words, even if they were grumbles about the thinness of the broth. So conversations sparked across benches, complaints about the cold, stories of hunts, gossip about the steward. These words were as nourishing as the food itself, carrying people through the night with humour and camaraderie. You sit at one of these benches now, your cloak wrapped tight, your hands cupping a bowl of pottage. The steam warms your face as you listen to the hum of voices, the scrape of knives, the flicker of laughter. The hall is smoky. Your belly is only half full, but you are not alone. And that fact alone makes the hunger easier to bear. Scholars note that such communal meals blurred the line between ritual and necessity. They were religious, political, and social, all at once occasions to demonstrate wealth, to reinforce bonds, to remind every soul that the household endured together. On the coldest nights, when the snow outside seemed endless, these gatherings reassured all who sat in the hall. Survival was not an individual feat, but a collective act. So, in the draughty, candle-lit chambers of castles, meals were never merely about food. They were about presence, about warmth stolen from fire and company alike. Even when the broth was thin and the bread stale, the hall itself vibrated with life. To sit together, to eat together, to breathe the same smoky air that was a feast in its own right. The great hall hums with conversation and song, but if you step through the side door into the kitchens again, you are swallowed by another world entirely one of fire, smoke, and labor. Here the air is thick, almost choking, as dozens of hearths and open flames roar beneath blackened chimneys. The scent is overwhelming. Roasted meat dripping fat into pans, onions sizzling in pots, bread baking in ovens. And yet behind the richness lies grit. This is where the castle's food was born, and it was not a gentle process. Contemporary descriptions of castle kitchens emphasize their scale: vast, cavernous spaces where fires burned almost constantly. Stone walls bore soot stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The ceilings vanished into smoke, rafters dark with centuries of grease. Imagine standing here on a January night. The snow may rage outside, but inside you sweat under the weight of heat and smoke. One telling detail from household accounts reveals the sheer amount of fuel consumed. Logs were dragged daily from nearby forests, carted into the yard, and chopped endlessly. It took an army of woodcutters and servants to keep the fires alive, not for luxury but for survival. Without steady flame, bread could not rise, meat could not roast, and porridge could not simmer. You realize quickly that kitchens were as much engines as they were dining spaces. An offbeat glimpse from a 15th century source describes turnspit dogs, small, sturdy animals trained to run on wheels that rotated roasting spits. Imagine the sight: a little dog panting in its wheel, the spit turning slowly, a goose browning over the fire. Some historians debate whether this was more myth than widespread reality, but the detail captures the ingenuity and the cruelty hidden in the pursuit of roasted dinners. Scholars still disagree on how sophisticated castle kitchens were compared to urban taverns or monasteries. Some argue they were primitive, relying on brute force and endless labor. Others highlight evidence of elaborate tools, iron grates, cauldrons, even early ovens that suggest surprising complexity. Perhaps both are true. Ingenuity and exhaustion existed side by side, the brilliance of invention fueled by the grind of servitude. Now picture the cooks at work. One wipes her brow with a flour-dusted sleeve, barking orders at apprentices who scurry with bowls of chopped leeks. Another ladles thick broth from a cauldron, tastes it, grimaces, and throws in a pinch of herbs. A boy scuttles past with a basket of bread, while another coughs from the smoke, eyes watering, yet keeps chopping onions. The heat is brutal, the air heavy, but no one stops. The castle depends on them. A curious anecdote from a French chronicle describes how nobles sometimes toured their kitchens, marveling at the chaos. A lord might stride in, cloaked in fur, wrinkle his nose at the smoke, and nod approvingly at the rows of roasting spits. To him it was spectacle, the proof of his wealth embodied in the labor of dozens. To the cooks, it was simply another endless night. Step closer to the hearth. You feel the fire on your face, hot enough to sting. Sparks jump upward, the iron cauldron hisses, and the fat dripping from the spit sizzles as it hits the pan. The sound is constant popping, bubbling, crackling, a music of sustenance. It is mesmerizing but also exhausting. You know that behind this fire lies another kind of hunger, the hunger of those who labor and rarely taste the fruits of their effort. Some specialists argue that castle kitchens were breeding grounds for accidents. Burns, smoke inhalation, slips on greasy floors, these were everyday hazards. Yet others claim kitchens were highly organized, almost militarized in their discipline, reducing chaos to routine. The debate remains, but either way, the labor left its mark. Blackened walls, calloused hands, scarred arms, and meals that carried the taste of both fire and toil. Imagine a winter feast in progress. The cooks rush to finish dishes on time, knowing the Lord waits impatiently. One spits curses as he struggles to lift a cauldron, another slaps a boy who let bread overbake. Outside the door, servants line up to carry platters into the hall, balancing them carefully, aware that a single stumble could cost their position. Inside the kitchen, there is no music, no laughter, only heat, work, and smoke. A peculiar tidbit from folklore suggests that kitchens were thought to be haunted, their fires attracting spirits. Whether superstition or weary imagination, you can understand it. The shadows cast by the flames dance across the walls, shapes flickering like ghostly figures. At midnight, when the fires die down and the cooks finally rest, the kitchen must have felt uncanny, too silent, too empty after so much noise. You crouch by the fire yourself, hands stretched toward the blaze. The warmth seeps into your skin, though smoke stings your eyes and nose. You taste the air salt, grease, ash, and realize that this is the true flavor of castle survival. Every dish carried the imprint of fire. Every bite echoed the labor of those who worked in suffocating heat to fend off the cold outside. So when you think of medieval feasts, picture not only the candlelit hall and gleaming platters, remember also the smoke-blackened kitchens, the endless chopping, stirring, turning, and sweating. Remember the hands that blistered so others could eat. For in the coldest nights of the year, food was not just warmth on the tongue, it was fire in the kitchen, smoke in the lungs, and the relentless rhythm of labor that kept an entire household alive. The smoke-blackened kitchen quiets for a moment, and into that silence slips another layer of medieval belief. Food was not only fuel, but medicine. On the coldest nights, when coughs rattled through the dormitories and frostbite nipped at fingers, cooks and stewards turned their attention to broths and brews that promised more than nourishment. They promised healing, or at least the comforting illusion of it. Contemporary medical treatises frequently mention broths for strength, recipes that blended meat, herbs, and wine. A sickly noble might sip chicken broth simmered with sage, parsley, or hyssop, while a soldier with a winter chill might be handed a steaming cup of onion soup. The logic was simple. Warmth in the belly translated to warmth in the body. Imagine the relief of pressing a wooden cup to your lips, the vapor rising like a balm against the biting air, each swallow spreading a fleeting sense of vigor. An unexpected glimpse comes from a household manual advising cooks to prepare broth from the bones of hens for those weary in body. The bones were boiled until marrow seeped into the liquid, creating a rich, almost silky broth. You picture a pale servant lying near the fire, spoon trembling in his hand as he tastes the hot liquid, cheeks flushing faintly as if life had returned. Scholars continue to disagree about whether such remedies had any genuine effect beyond warmth and hydration. Some argue the herbs garlic, sage, thyme did offer medicinal properties. Others contend it was mostly ritual, comfort disguised as cure. Yet in a world where professional physicians were scarce and winters merciless, the act of preparing a broth with care was itself a kind of healing. Picture the castle hall late in January. A cough echoes from the benches. A guard wraps a cloak tighter, his nose red and raw. The steward nods to the kitchen, and soon bowls of spiced wine are carried in, warmed with honey and pepper. The soldiers drink slowly, sighing as heat spreads through their frozen limbs. Was it medicine? Perhaps not, but it felt like it, and in those moments feeling mattered as much as fact. An odd detail tucked into a monastic record tells of eel broth prescribed for melancholy. The slippery, fatty fish was thought to soothe troubled minds. Imagine sipping such a concoction on a night when despair pressed as heavily as hunger. The flavour may have been questionable, but the belief in its power gave hope. And hope, like food, could keep a person alive. Another peculiar tidbit comes from folklore. Some households boiled ale with butter and spices to treat colds. The result, thick and frothy, was ladled into cups and handed to the sick. You can almost taste it now, sweet, greasy, heavy on the tongue. It may not cure a cough, but it filled the stomach, and sometimes that was cure enough. Step into the kitchen once more. A cook stands over a cauldron, dropping sprigs of rosemary into simmering broth. She stirs slowly, muttering about its power to strengthen the heart. At her side, a scullion crushes garlic with a stone, the sharp smell cutting through the haze of smoke. They may not know modern science, but they know that these flavors ease both body and spirit. The cauldron bubbles, the steam thickens, and soon bowls are passed to waiting hands. Specialists argue over whether medicinal broths were reserved solely for the Lord's household. Some evidence suggests nobles received the richer, spiced versions, while servants were left with thinner fare. Yet other accounts describe kitchens preparing herbal teas and onion soups for the sick of all ranks. The ambiguity reveals something essential. Illness did not respect hierarchy. When fever spread, everyone sought warmth from the same pot. Now picture yourself clutching one of these bowls. The broth is thin but steaming, the surface shimmering with droplets of fat. You sip carefully, the hot liquid scalding your tongue before sliding down your throat. Your chest warms, your stomach unclenches, and for a moment you feel stronger. Perhaps it is only illusion, but in the dark, freezing chambers of a castle, illusion can be enough. The air in the hall is filled with coughs and murmurs. A priest moves among the benches, blessing those too weak to rise. He too drinks the broth, murmuring that God has placed healing in herbs and roots. Belief knits itself into taste, making the dish not just medicine for the body but for the soul. So on winter nights, when hunger gnawed and sickness threatened, food transformed into remedy. It could not cure frostbite, nor stop the plague, but it offered warmth, strength, and faith. A spoonful of broth could soothe a cough. A sip of mulled wine could ease despair. And sometimes, that was enough to carry a household through the darkest hours until spring. The memory of medicinal broths lingers in your mind, but there were nights when the cauldrons ran low and cupboards echoed hollow. In those moments, survival demanded more than preservation. It demanded searching, even in the dead of winter, when snow crusted the fields and ice sealed the rivers. Desperate feet trudged into the woods and hedgerows. Foraging was never glamorous, but it was often the last fragile thread between the castle household and starvation. Castle records occasionally note allowances for gathered things, a vague phrase covering wild nuts, berries, and herbs collected from surrounding lands. Imagine a servant in a patched cloak crunching through snow, eyes sharp for signs of hazelnuts left clinging in the frosted underbrush. Perhaps he lifts a stone and finds a few acorns cached by squirrels, or scrapes bark to reveal edible inner layers. These were not feasts, but they were calories, and calories kept life moving. One unexpected detail comes from a Welsh chronicle describing families gathering nettles in late winter, boiling them into a thin green soup. The sting disappeared in the cooking, leaving something faintly nourishing. You picture the smell of that soup, grassy, bitter, almost metallic, filling the kitchen as bowls were handed out to weary hands. To a hungry stomach, even nettles were a blessing. Some historians argue that noble households rarely foraged, relying instead on stored supplies and trade. Others counter that even castles, in lean years, sent out parties to scour frozen fields and woods. The truth likely lies between. Nobility insulated themselves from desperation most of the time, but when famine clawed at the door, No household was too proud to send foragers into the cold. Imagine the scene outside the castle walls. Snow lies heavy on the branches. Crows circle overhead. The river groans beneath its crust of ice. A small group trudges forward, baskets slung on their backs. They break through drifts to find mushrooms beneath dead logs, pull wild garlic bulbs from half-frozen soil, or shake trees for the last clinging crabapples. Their fingers ache, their breath clouds the air, but each discovery feels like treasure. A curious anecdote from a manor roll describes roasted chestnuts sold at inflated prices in midwinter. Too precious for common folk, they sometimes appeared at the Lord's table, steaming and fragrant, cracked open to reveal pale flesh inside. Down in the kitchens, servants might roast acorns instead, bitter and chewy, but still something to chew when bread had run out. Specialists continue to debate the role of hunting in these foraging efforts. Some argue that snares for rabbits and traps for birds were common winter supplements. Others claim game was too scarce, the woods too barren, leaving households reliant on plants and nuts alone. Whichever view holds, the fact remains. Desperation blurred lines. A nobleman's deer hunt was prestige. A peasant's rabbit trap was survival. Both kept bellies from gnawing themselves hollow. Step into the kitchen after one such foraging trip. The baskets are unpacked. A few handfuls of walnuts, a clutch of roots scraped from frozen earth, a bundle of nettles tied with twine. The cook examines them with a critical eye, then sets to work. Nuts are cracked with stones, tossed into a pot. Roots are chopped and boiled, their earthy smell filling the air. Nettles are crushed into a green mash. None of it tastes good, but when stirred together into broth, it becomes edible. Another odd tidbit recorded in folklore suggests that eating certain winter berries warded off spirits of hunger. Whether symbolic or not, you can imagine a mother pressing a few shriveled berries into her child's hand, whispering that they would keep him safe. The child eats them dutifully, puckering at the sourness, but comforted by the story as much as by the food. Picture the hall now on such a night. The nobles still receive portions of salted meat and bread, though thinner than before. The servants, however, clutch bowls of foraged stew, steaming but sparse. A soldier chews a walnut slowly, cracking the shell with his teeth, savouring the faint oiliness on his tongue. Another dunks a piece of bread into nettle broth, swallowing quickly, pretending not to mind the bitterness. The hall is quieter tonight. Hunger dampens conversation as effectively as any priest's command. There is ongoing discussion among scholars about whether foraging truly mattered in the grand scale of castle survival, or whether it was more symbolic than substantial. Some argue the quantities gathered were too small to make a real difference. Others counter that when hunger sharpened, even a handful of nuts could mean the difference between enduring and fainting at one's post. Perhaps the scale mattered less than the act. To forage was to fight against despair, to search for proof that the earth still offered something. You bite into a roasted chestnut in your imagination. The flesh is soft, sweet, smoky. For a moment, it is more than food, it is warmth itself, a tiny defiance of winter's grip. Around you, others chew roots and nettles, some grimacing, some silent, all grateful nonetheless. The feast may be humble, but it is enough to quiet stomachs for one more night. So on the coldest nights, when storerooms emptied and barrels ran dry, the castle reached outward into woods, fields, and hedgerows. Foraging did not guarantee survival, but it gave hope. And sometimes, hope was the most nourishing dish of all. The memory of nettle stews and roasted chestnuts fades as you step once again into the glow of the great hall. Tonight, however, the atmosphere feels different. The tables are fuller, the music livelier, and the aromas richer. For though winter nights were often marked by scarcity, there were moments when the lord of the castle summoned splendor to remind his household and his rivals that wealth endured even in the snow. On such nights, the tables bore luxuries fit to dazzle: swans, peacocks, and boars' heads, extravagant creatures whose presence at the high table was as symbolic as it was edible. Contemporary feast records frequently describe the spectacle of these dishes. A roasted boar's head, for example, was often served with gilded tusks, an apple clenched between its teeth, and rosemary sprigs bristling from its jaws. Imagine the gasps as servants carried it into the hall, the firelight catching the gold, the fragrance of fat and herbs mingling with candle smoke. For nobles, such a dish was not simply food, it was a declaration of power, proof that even winter could not starve their household into humility. One extraordinary detail comes from descriptions of swans and peacocks, roasted whole, then dressed again in their brilliant feathers, sometimes even gilded with gold leaf. Picture the scene: the shimmering blue-green neck of a peacock arched proudly, feathers spread wide, its body steaming with roasted flesh beneath. It was spectacle first, supper second. Guests marveled, servants whispered, and for a moment hunger was replaced by awe. Some experts argue that such dishes were rarely eaten, valued more as centerpieces than as sustenance. Others insist that the meat was carved and served to the highest-ranking guests, leaving the spectacle stripped by the end of the meal. The truth is hard to pin down, but either way, the symbolism mattered more than the taste. A peacock, resplendent in feathers, told every soul in the hall that their lord's reach extended across forests, rivers, and trade routes. Step closer to the dais. The lord sits back in his chair, his fur cloak gleaming in the firelight, as servants carve thick slices of boar for his platter. A cup of spiced wine rests by his hand. His guests murmur their admiration, lifting bites of richly seasoned meat. Down the benches, guards sniff the air hungrily, hoping for scraps. Perhaps a trencher soaked in dripping will make its way to them. The division is stark, but for tonight the grandeur of the feast seems to silence complaint. An unusual anecdote from a 14th-century banquet tells of a pie baked so large that it concealed a live bird. When cut open, the bird flew out, startling diners and inspiring laughter. Whether fact or embellishment, it reflects the theatricality of noble dining. In winter, when hunger gnawed constantly, such displays reminded everyone that food could still be art, power, and performance. Specialists continue to debate whether such luxury foods were practical or wasteful. Some point to the calories they provided: meat rich in fat and protein, essential in winter. Others argue that the expense of preparing them outweighed their nutritional value, turning them into hollow symbols of wealth. The debate lingers, but the dual role of these dishes, both sustenance and statement, is undeniable. Picture the kitchen as such a feast is prepared. Dozens of hands labor over a single bird, plucking, roasting, redressing in feathers, painting with gold leaf. The heat is suffocating, the air heavy with the smell of roasting fat. Servants mutter under their breath, knowing that most of them will never taste the meat they prepare. Yet when the dish emerges, gleaming and whole, even they cannot help but marvel. Another curious tidbit lies in medieval poetry, which sometimes mocked the extravagance of feasts, contrasting them with the hunger of the poor. Better a bowl of hot porridge than a gilded goose. One line sneers, yet the lords persisted. Extravagance was not for the tongue, it was for the eyes, for reputation, for power, whispered across candlelit tables. Now imagine yourself sitting at the lower end of the hall. Your bowl holds only pottage, but your eyes cannot help but follow the procession of dishes to the high table. The boar's head gleams, the peacock dazzles, the swan spreads its wings. You feel both envy and awe. You may never taste such creatures, but their presence reassures you. If the Lord can command such feasts, perhaps the household will survive the winter after all. Scholars note that these luxury foods often appeared during midwinter festivals, Christmas, Epiphany, or Candlemas. They marked turning points in the calendar, brief reprieves from monotony, signals that light and warmth would return eventually. For one night, hunger gave way to spectacle, and even servants felt lifted by the sheer grandeur of what they witnessed. You close your eyes now and imagine biting into a slice of boar. The meat is dark, rich, spiced with cloves. It fills your mouth with heat and salt, and for a moment, The cold seems banished. Around you the hall glows brighter, voices rise louder, and winter's grip loosens, if only for a few hours. So, on the coldest nights of the year, luxury foods were more than indulgence. They were theatre, reassurance, and power embodied in flesh and feather. They reminded the castle that survival was not only about enduring scarcity, but also about proclaiming resilience. And for those who tasted or merely watched, the message was clear. The household still stood strong against the winter. The echoes of laughter and spectacle from the Lord's table linger, but if you sit back and truly watch the flow of food in the hall, you begin to notice something deeper. Every dish, whether plain porridge or a gilded peacock, was more than nourishment. It was a marker of rank, a visible sign of where you stood in the social order. In the coldest nights of the year, food didn't just fill bellies, it drew invisible lines across the hall, reinforcing who held power and who merely endured. Household ordinances from great castles often spell out in painstaking detail who received what at supper. Nobles were granted venison, white bread, spiced wine. Knights and officials ate boiled mutton, dark bread, ale. Servants scraped by on pottage and turnips. The records read less like menus than like blueprints of hierarchy. Imagine the steward reading them aloud in the kitchen, his finger tapping the parchment. The Lord shall have this. The knights shall have that. The grooms shall make do with the rest. One striking detail comes from a 15th century English ordinance, which ordered that trenchers from the high table be collected, not discarded, and specifically distributed to named retainers. The message was clear: even leftovers had rank. A trencher soaked in swan sauce might go to a favoured knight. One that bore only cabbage broth might trickle down to a stable boy. Status was literally tasted in the scraps. Some historians argue that food served as the most visible symbol of feudal order, more immediate than clothing or titles. Others counter that while hierarchy was real, communal eating softened the divide, as all shared the same space and fire. The debate lingers, but in the smoky glow of the hall, you see how the two truths coexisted. The Lord's golden dish and the servant's wooden bowl may have been worlds apart, yet both sat within earshot of the same minstrel's song. Picture the moment the Lord lifts his knife to carve venison. Silence ripples outward. Servants pause mid-bite, eyes flicking upward. When the first slice is placed on the silver platter before him, it is more than food. It is authority made flesh. Then, gradually, the noise resumes, bowls are lifted again, and the ordinary rhythm of chewing and swallowing returns. The entire hall has acknowledged, without words, that meat at the top affirms power all the way down. A curious anecdote recorded by a visiting Italian merchant tells of his shock at seeing nobles in northern castles drink spiced wine while their servants drank only small ale. "The drink alone tells the rank of the drinker," he wrote. You can almost hear his amazement. Even the liquid in your cup betrayed who you were. Now step back into the kitchen corridors. Servants whisper as they carry platters. One jokes that he will lick the spoon before handing it to the knight, earning a sharp slap from the cook. Another mutters about how unfair it is that the Lord's dogs gnaw on meat bones while his own children go to bed with cabbage broth. The bitterness never vanishes entirely, yet it rarely explodes. The order of food is too deeply ingrained to be questioned openly. Specialists continue to debate whether servants truly accepted these divides as natural, or whether resentment simmered quietly. Some chronicles mention riots when food grew scarce, kitchens stormed by hungry retainers. Others describe loyalty so strong that men would defend their lord even on empty stomachs. Perhaps, as with so much in history, both extremes were real, depending on the household and the severity of the winter. An offbeat detail preserved in folklore suggests that lords sometimes tested loyalty through food, handing a favoured servant a choice cut at supper, watching how he reacted. Did he bow with gratitude? Did jealousy flare among others? Such gestures were small, but in the candlelit politics of the great hall, they mattered. A slice of boar could bind or divide more effectively than a signed contract. Imagine yourself seated halfway down the table. Your bowl holds barley gruel. Your bread is dark. Your ale weak. Yet your eyes keep drifting upward to the Lord's dais, where golden platters gleam. You do not expect to share in them, you know your place, but you cannot help but wonder what venison tastes like spiced with cloves. You chew your bread more slowly, stretching the flavor, trying to imagine. Hunger feeds not only the stomach but also the imagination. Another curious note appears in Chronicles of Lent, when rules technically placed lord and servant on equal footing. All ate fish, no one ate meat. Yet even then, inequality remained. The Lord's fish was fresh pike dressed in saffron. The servant's was salted herring. Same rule, different reality. Food never ceased to reflect hierarchy, even when the church demanded otherwise. Now the hall quiets as prayers are spoken. Everyone bows their heads, but the smells still tell the story. At the dais, the fragrance of roasted meat clings to the air. At the benches, only the sharp tang of onions and ale lingers. Even in silence, the division persists. And so you see that on the coldest nights, when survival itself was uncertain, food was more than sustenance. It was ceremony, symbol, language. Every slice, every crumb, every sip carried meaning about who you were, who you served, and how the world was ordered. The snow outside might make all men shiver alike, but inside the castle, the spoon in your hand reminded you exactly where you stood. The great hall grows quieter as the last scraps of bread are swept away, yet the hum of voices does not end. For in the medieval castle, food was never just about filling the belly. It was tied to faith, ritual, and prayer. On the coldest nights, when the wind clawed at the shutters and frost whitened the flagstones, the rhythm of eating was guided by the rhythm of religion. To dine was also to honor God, and every dish carried whispers of devotion. Household accounts and church ordinances frequently describe how meals began and ended with prayer. Before any trencher was touched, the steward or chaplain raised his voice to bless the food. Imagine the sound. Dozens of benches creaking as everyone bowed their heads, the hall falling still except for the crackle of the fire. The words echoed through the smoky air, sanctifying bowls of pottage as surely as gilded roasts. Even if your bread was stale and your ale weak, prayer transformed the meal into something shared under heaven's watch. One vivid detail comes from descriptions of Lent, when the rules of fasting were most strict. Meat vanished from the tables for weeks, replaced by fish, grains, and vegetables. Almond milk often took the place of dairy, thickening stews and sauces. Picture the kitchen filled with the grinding of almonds, the air heavy with their nutty fragrance. For nobles, it was a chance to display wealth. Almonds were imported, costly, precious. For servants, it was a reminder that even in fasting, hierarchy remained. The Lord's almond custard, the servant's barley gruel. Some experts argue that fasting was embraced with sincerity, shaping the spiritual life of the household. Others suggest it was often skirted or bent, with loopholes. Beaver counted as fish, barnacle geese considered fair game, and sauces rich with spice masking what might have been forbidden flesh. The debate remains, but what is clear is that religion's hand stirred every pot, deciding what entered the cauldron and what did not. Imagine the hall on Ash Wednesday. The nobles sit at the high table, their dishes simple: fish pie, bread, perhaps a sauce of herbs. Down the benches, servants eat much the same, though portions are smaller, flavors plainer. For once the divide between high and low seems narrower. Hunger and holiness unite them, at least in form. Yet even here, difference whispers. The Lord's fish is fresh, the servant's salted. An odd anecdote from monastic chronicles tells of households debating whether eggs counted as flesh. Some cooks risked slipping them into sauces, others avoided them altogether. You can picture the argument in the smoky kitchen, the chaplain frowning, the steward shrugging, the cook sighing as she cracks an egg anyway. Faith may have ruled the castle, but pragmatism often ruled the cauldron. Step into the chapel after supper. The air is colder here, but filled with candlelight. Servants kneel beside knights, the Lord's family at the front. Their stomachs are not equally full, but their prayers rise together. The smell of incense mingles with the lingering scent of fish broth on their clothes. They cross themselves, murmur Amen, and shuffle back toward the dormitories, each carrying the warmth of ritual into the long night. Scholars continue to discuss whether religious meals created real solidarity or only the illusion of it. Some believe fasting days reminded everyone that all were equal before God. Others point to evidence that even during fasts, nobles managed to preserve their privilege through richer versions of the same dishes. Perhaps both are true. Faith blurred class lines slightly but never erased them. Another curious tidbit surfaces in miracle stories. Saints providing food in times of famine, loaves multiplying, fish appearing where none were expected. These tales filtered into castle halls, whispered by servants as they huddled near fires. Belief in divine provision offered hope on nights when storerooms ran low. If God once filled baskets with bread, perhaps he would again. Now imagine yourself on one of those nights. Your portion has been meager, little more than cabbage boiled in broth. Yet when the chaplain blesses it, you bow your head and murmur the prayer. The taste does not improve, but the act feels lighter. Hunger is still there, but so too is a sense of order that your suffering has meaning, that each empty stomach is a step toward salvation. So, within the castle walls, food and faith were inseparable. Every bowl was blessed. Every feast was shadowed by fasts. Every bite was tinged with ritual. On the coldest nights, when the wind screamed through the towers, meals became more than survival. They became prayers swallowed, one spoonful at a time. The chapel grows still, its candles sputtering low. But back in the great hall, another ritual takes shape, one not bound by prayers, but by the Lord's own will. For in a medieval castle, food was more than nourishment or faith. It was currency. Every loaf, every trencher, every salted joint of pork could be transformed into favor, loyalty, or obligation. On the coldest nights, the politics of food were written as clearly as any charter. Household ordinances and chronicles often note how lords distributed special dishes to favored retainers or guests. A slice of venison to a knight, a cup of spiced wine to a visiting merchant, a trencher from the lord's table given to a steward. It was generosity, but also strategy. Imagine the hush that fell when the lord gestured for a servant to carry a gilded platter down the table to a chosen retainer. The hall watched, envious, aware that this was no accident. It was a message, loyalty rewarded, hierarchy reaffirmed. One telling detail emerges from a 14th century banquet record describing how extra portions of meat were carved specifically for men-at-arms who had performed well in winter skirmishes. A knight who had risked his life at the gate received not only coin, but a roast haunch before the whole hall. The meat nourished his body, but the public gift nourished his pride. Some historians argue that such gestures were deliberate tools of control, keeping households bound to their lord by stomach as well as sword. Others suggest they were simply practical, a way of sharing scarce resources fairly. The debate continues, but as you watch the flicker of envy in the eyes of those who received less, you sense the truth leans toward politics. Food was never neutral. Picture the servants' corner on such a night. They eat their thin broth as usual, but one of them, perhaps the cook's favoured assistant, receives a trencher from the high table, soaked with rich gravy. She chews it slowly, eyes closed, ignoring the stares of those beside her. For that night, she is elevated, if only by a crust of bread. Tomorrow she may return to cabbage stew, but tonight she tastes power. An unusual anecdote comes from Burgundian court records, where entire barrels of wine were given as gifts to visiting envoys during winter feasts. The envoys recorded the generosity in their letters, praising not just the hospitality but the wealth it displayed. Wine was more than drink, it was diplomacy poured into goblets. Specialists still argue whether the distribution of food in castles softened or sharpened class divisions. Some believe generosity at table forged bonds across ranks, creating a sense of unity in hardship. Others counter that it heightened jealousy, as every unequal portion reminded diners of their place. Perhaps it did both, feeding loyalty in some, resentment in others, yet always reinforcing the Lord's authority. Step into the kitchen after one of these feasts. The platters return, scraped clean, but the cooks gossip about who received what. One boy snickers that the steward got less venison than usual. Another whispers that the captain of guards received 2 trenchers instead of 1. Even in the smoky backrooms, the politics of portions ripple outward. A curious tidbit preserved in folklore suggests that bread blessed at the Lord's table carried luck if shared with a retainer. Some lords broke loaves deliberately, handing fragments to favoured men as tokens. Was it superstition or shrewdness? Perhaps both. To receive such a gift meant more than food, it meant inclusion in the circle of privilege. Now imagine yourself seated low in the hall. Your bowl of porridge is plain, yet suddenly a servant approaches, carrying down a trencher from above. He sets it before you, bread soaked in goose fat, the faint taste of spice clinging to its edges. Your neighbours glance at you, envy sharp in their eyes. You bow your head toward the dais, knowing this gesture is no accident. You chew slowly, tasting not just food but recognition. The hall hums again with voices, but the lesson is clear. Food was a language of power. Every portion spoke, every trencher carried meaning. To dine in a castle was to read a text written in meat and bread, a text that reminded each soul of their place in the order of things. So, on winter nights, when hunger pressed hardest, food became politics as much as sustenance. It rewarded, punished, bound, and divided. And every bite, whether plain or spiced, was seasoned with the knowledge that power flowed not only through coin and sword, but also through the simple act of who received what at supper. The torches in the hall flicker lower, and the echoes of clattering trenchers fade. Yet the night is not done, for in a medieval castle the story of food extended beyond the hall and the kitchen. What was eaten or left uneaten moved into another sphere of meaning entirely: superstition and folklore. For the people who huddled in those stone walls believed deeply that what you ate, when you ate it, and how you treated leftovers could shape fortune, health, and even divine favour. Manuscripts and household accounts often include curious notes on lucky and unlucky foods. Bread, blessed by a priest, for instance, was thought to protect against illness if eaten during storms. Imagine the comfort of clutching a crust, whispering a prayer, and believing that the rough chew in your mouth was a shield against the winter plague. In a world of relentless cold and hunger, such faith was its own nourishment. One vivid detail comes from English folklore. Spilling salt at the high table was considered a dire omen. The grains represented purity and preservation, and wasting them meant inviting chaos. Picture the hall as a servant trips, scattering a pinch of salt across the floor. Conversations hush. Eyes dart nervously. The Lord frowns, and a murmured prayer rises to ward off the ill luck. The salt is swept, but the unease lingers through the meal. Some historians argue that these food superstitions were practical in origin, warnings not to waste scarce supplies. Others see them as spiritual, binding everyday life to cosmic order. The debate continues, but to the medieval mind, there was no sharp divide. The sacred and the mundane were braided tightly together, like herbs hanging from the rafters to dry. An unexpected glimpse appears in a French household roll describing how cheese rinds were never discarded hastily. They were either fed to dogs or burned in the hearth. Tossing them aside carelessly was said to invite rats into the storerooms. Imagine the scene: a scullion gnawing a rind, muttering about keeping the vermin away, half believing, half hungry. Even scraps had to be handled with ritual. A curious tidbit from monastic chronicles tells of beans being linked with spirits of the dead. Eating them at certain times of year was thought to open doors between worlds. In castles, Beans were still staples of pottage, but whispers of their ghostly associations lingered. Picture servants trading tales over their bowls. Eat too many beans at midnight, and you'll hear the dead knocking. They laugh nervously, but still glance at the darkened corners of the hall. Now imagine a January feast where superstition shapes the table. The Lord demands a roasted boar's head for luck in hunting. The head arrives, adorned with rosemary and apples, its eyes glazed, its tusks polished. Nobles clap politely, but everyone knows the deeper meaning. The boar's strength will protect the household through the cold months. Down the benches, servants chew their bread quietly, whispering that to touch the apple in the boar's mouth is to ensure health for the year. Specialists remain divided on how seriously these beliefs were taken. Some claim they were playful customs, part of the theatre of dining. Others insist they were deadly serious, woven into every decision about what to store, serve, or share. What cannot be denied is that food was never neutral. Every bite carried meaning beyond taste. Picture the kitchens late at night, after the hall has emptied. Bones are gathered carefully, not left scattered. Some are boiled again for broth, others buried to quiet the spirits of beasts. The cook mutters charms as she stirs tomorrow's pottage, not because she truly believes in witches or ghosts, but because generations before her have done the same. Tradition clings to every pot and ladle. Another unusual belief attached to leftovers. It was considered unlucky to throw away bread, even stale or mouldy. Instead, it had to be fed to animals or placed respectfully aside. Bread symbolized Christ's body, and wasting it invited divine displeasure. Imagine a servant hiding a crumbling crust in his cloak, unwilling to discard it. He may not be hungry enough to eat it, but neither will he dare to toss it into the fire. Step into the dormitories now. Servants lie on straw pallets, guards curl in cloaks, the smell of supper still clinging to their hands. They murmur about omens, whether the trencher thrown to the dogs was a bad sign, whether the spilled ale foretold a quarrel, whether the faint cry of an owl outside meant famine. In the flickering lamplight, such talk feels less like gossip and more like survival. To interpret food was to interpret fate. And you, sitting quietly with the taste of onion broth still lingering on your tongue, realize how fragile the line was between eating and believing. A crust of bread was not only calories, it was luck. A pinch of salt was not only flavor, it was fate. A bean was not only supper, it was a whisper from the dead. So, on the coldest nights, when hunger pressed sharpest and fear pressed harder, superstition filled the gaps left by empty bowls. Food became charm, omen, prayer. To eat was to survive, yes, but also to ward, to hope, to believe. And belief itself was as necessary as bread in a castle winter. The whispers of omens and charms fade as the castle settles deeper into the night. Yet, even after the hall is cleared and the kitchens swept, the story of food is not finished. For in winter castles, what was not eaten became as important as what was. Leftovers and waste were rarely allowed to vanish. They were repurposed, redistributed, and sometimes even transformed into entirely new meals. On the coldest nights of the year, survival often depended on the art of making yesterday's scraps into tomorrow's supper. Castle ordinances and household accounts often note second-day stews or reboiled meats. Imagine a pot of pottage simmering for the third night in a row, with bones and bread crusts thrown back in, the broth deepening in flavor with each reheat. It wasn't wasteful, it was practical. Every scrap of marrow, every shred of vegetable, every drop of dripping was coaxed into one more spoonful of sustenance. One striking detail comes from a 15th century recipe collection describing sippets bread, soaked in leftover meat juices, served as supper for servants. The trencher, once a platter at the Lord's table, became the next day's meal for the household's lower ranks. Picture a guard tearing into the soggy crust, chewing slowly as the flavors of last night's feast linger faintly on his tongue. For him, That soggy bread was not humiliation, it was survival wrapped in grease. Some historians argue that leftovers reinforced hierarchy, with nobles receiving the best of the fresh food while servants made do with scraps. Others counter that leftovers actually blurred boundaries, for the trencher from the high table gave servants access, however indirect, to flavors and ingredients they could never otherwise taste. The truth is layered. Leftovers were both reminder and bridge, both division and connection. Step into the kitchen on a January morning. The cook stirs a pot with visible determination. Into the broth go bones from last night's venison, a fistful of barley, a splash of ale gone flat, and a handful of wilted herbs. The scullions bring her bowls of yesterday's bread, already hard, which she crumbles in with a sharp gesture. The smell grows richer, not poorer, as if time itself has seasoned the pot. Soon, the entire household will taste it, lord in his chamber, guard in the hall, servant in the yard. An odd little tidbit from folklore warns against letting dogs lick bones too clean. It was said that doing so would steal the strength meant for the household. Instead, bones were often reboiled, scraped or crushed, sometimes even fed into bread dough for extra bulk. Imagine the crunch of grit between your teeth, the faint taste of marrow clinging stubbornly. Waste was not a concept castles could afford. Specialists still debate how much of this frugality was necessity versus habit. Some argue it arose from sheer survival in harsh winters. Others insist it became tradition, even in times of plenty, because throwing away food carried moral and spiritual weight. Bread, in particular, was sacred, never discarded, always repurposed. A stale loaf might be grated into crumbs for thickening sauces, or boiled into ale soup for children. Picture the dormitory after supper. Servants lie on their pallets, full enough but not satisfied. They murmur about what tomorrow's pottage might taste like, whether the cook will stretch the bones again or whether she might finally add a bit of bacon. They laugh softly, half joking, half serious, because the thought of tomorrow's stew is both dread and comfort. It may be monotonous, but it will be there. Another curious anecdote comes from a Burgundian record of a feast where half-eaten trenchers were gathered and distributed to the poor waiting outside the castle gates. Imagine the line of villagers, cloaks pulled tight, hands red from cold, receiving bread soaked in rich gravies. To them, those scraps were abundance. The act was both charity and performance, the Lord demonstrating piety while easing the burden of waste. Now imagine yourself clutching a trencher from the night before. The bread is soft with fat, tinged with the faint spice of pepper. You chew slowly, savoring every trace of flavor, feeling warmth spread from your belly outward. You know it is only a scrap, yet in the cold darkness, it feels like a feast. You whisper a prayer of thanks, not for luxury, but for enough. And so the cycle of food in a castle winter was never linear. It spiraled, feast into scraps, scraps into broth, broth into survival. Nothing was wasted, not even bones gnawed bare. On the coldest nights, it was this endless reinvention of leftovers that kept hunger at bay. So when you think of medieval dining, don't picture only golden platters and steaming roasts. Remember also the simmering pots of scraps, the trenchers passed down, the broth reboiled again and again. For in the end, it was not the feasts that sustained the castle through winter, but the quiet, relentless art of making yesterday's food live again today. The smell of reheated broth clings to the hall long after the bowls are emptied. Yet food in a medieval castle was never only about hunger or hierarchy, it was also about season. What you ate on the coldest nights depended entirely on what had been stored from autumn's bounty. Winter was not merely endured, it was prepared for, and those preparations determined whether the household thrived or starved. Castle records often list inventories of barrels, sacks, and casks carefully counted at year's end. Salted pork hung from rafters, dried peas filled sacks, flour rested in wooden bins, and apples were tucked into straw to keep them from spoiling. Imagine the steward walking with his ledger, candle in hand, frowning at the dwindling numbers. Every tally was a calculation. How many mouths? How many weeks? How many chances to stretch food before spring returned? One vivid detail emerges from accounts of harvest celebrations. Surplus grains were threshed, dried, and stored in enormous granaries designed to outlast winter storms. The scent of dust and earth filled those spaces, the air heavy with the promise of bread and porridge. Yet every servant knew the truth. A single damp draught could spoil an entire store, turning food into rot overnight. The granary was both treasure chest and time bomb. Some historians argue that noble castles were well insulated against scarcity, with vast stores and trade connections. Others counter that even the grandest halls faced famine when harvests failed or trade routes froze. The debate continues, but the evidence suggests winter pressed hard on all, from peasant cottage to fortress keep. Picture the storeroom on a bitter February evening. Barrels of salted fish line the walls, their stench sharp in the nose. Sacks of beans slump against stone, some sprouting mould. A basket of apples sits in straw, the skins wrinkled, the flesh soft but edible. A servant reaches in, selects the least shriveled fruit, and bites cautiously. The sweetness is faint, but it is enough to lift his spirits. An unusual anecdote from a German castle inventory describes dried herbs carefully bundled and hung from rafters: sage, thyme, mint. These herbs not only flavored stews but also offered a reminder of summer, their scent cutting through the monotony of salted meat. Imagine crushing a leaf between your fingers, inhaling its green fragrance, and remembering sunlight long buried by snow. Specialists still debate how strictly rationing was enforced. Some argue stewards measured every portion with rigid precision, doling out barley and beans by the handful. Others suggest more flexibility, with surpluses consumed freely early in winter, only to leave households desperate in March. Both patterns appear in records, and both reveal the same truth. The future was always uncertain. Step into the kitchens in late January. The cook opens a sack of peas and pours them into a cauldron. The dried legumes clatter like stones, their hardness softened only by hours of boiling. A scullion stirs them with a wooden paddle, the broth thickening slowly. Into the pot go onions, scraps of pork, and herbs from last autumn. The smell is earthy, comforting, faintly smoky. The servants wait patiently, bowls in hand, knowing this meal will taste almost identical to yesterday's and the day before. A curious tidbit from folklore claims that eating the last apple from storage brought luck, so long as it was shared among the household. You can picture a steward lifting a wrinkled fruit, slicing it carefully into thin wedges, handing a piece to each servant. The taste is meager, but the symbolism is powerful. The winter is nearly done. The stores have lasted. Hope endures. Now imagine the hall on a midwinter feast day. Despite dwindling supplies, the Lord orders a barrel of wine opened, a pie baked with dried fruit, and cheese cut from its rind. The nobles toast to survival, the servants cheer faintly, and for one night the anxiety of rationing softens. Tomorrow the ledger will resume its grim tally, but tonight the household breathes easier. Scholars note that preparation for winter was as much ritual as practicality. Harvest festivals, storehouse blessings, and prayers for preservation marked the shift from plenty to scarcity. The act of storing was a declaration of faith in endurance. Every sack of grain set aside in autumn was a promise whispered against the uncertainty of snow. You pick up a piece of bread now, baked from flour ground months ago. The crust is hard, the crumb dense, but the taste carries a memory of fields golden in sunlight. You chew slowly, feeling both gratitude and longing. The loaf is not just food, it is the stored warmth of summer, waiting patiently in a dark storeroom until this moment. So, on the coldest nights of the year, castle survival depended on foresight. What had been salted, dried, and stored months earlier became the lifeline for January and February. Each bite was a reminder of autumn's labor, of stewards' calculations, of cooks' creativity. Winter was not only endured day by day, It was endured because autumn had prepared the table long before snow ever touched the ground. The storerooms grow barer with each passing week, and the anxiety of dwindling supplies gnaws at the household. Yet in many castles, relief sometimes arrived not from within but from without. Trade, markets, and travelling merchants carried lifelines of grain, fish, salt, and wine across frozen landscapes. Even in the depths of winter, wagons creaked over icy roads, bringing provisions that could mean the difference between hunger and survival. Medieval accounts often describe winter markets held in nearby towns, where castle stewards haggled over sacks of barley or barrels of herring. Imagine the scene: a square crowded with stalls despite the snow, the air biting cold, merchants stamping their feet as they shouted prices. The smell of smoked fish, dried fruit, and fresh bread mixed with the odour of wet wool and horse sweat. For those within castle walls, the arrival of such goods was both mundane and miraculous. One vivid detail comes from a Flemish record of a January purchase. Barrels of salted cod hauled in from coastal ports rolled across the courtyard into storerooms. The fish was stiff, pale, reeking of brine, yet invaluable. Without them, fasting days would be misery. With them, they became at least tolerable. Picture the cook prying open a barrel, her nose wrinkling, while scullions carried the heavy slabs inside, their fingers red and raw from cold brine. Some historians argue that castles relied heavily on long-distance trade even in winter, especially for luxuries like wine, almonds, or spices. Others counter that trade was sporadic, dangerous on icy roads, and most households endured mainly on local stores. The debate continues, but both perspectives show the precarious balance. One missed delivery could starve a haul. Imagine the excitement when a merchant caravan arrived. Children ran to the gates, guards shouted orders, dogs barked. Wagons creaked into the yard, piled with sacks of flour, baskets of raisins, and jugs of olive oil. For the lord, these were signs of prestige, proof that his wealth could command abundance despite the snow. For servants, they were salvation. The chance for fresher bread, richer broth, a taste of something beyond turnips. An offbeat anecdote from an English account describes a merchant delivering oranges to a northern castle in midwinter. The fruits, rare and costly, were sliced thin and presented to the lord's family like jewels. Down at the benches, servants whispered in disbelief, how could such brightness grow in the dead of snow? The orange slices glistened like miniature suns, symbols of wealth that reached across continents. Specialists continue to discuss whether such trade truly alleviated hunger or merely masked inequality. Some argue that imported foods lightened monotony for all, as surplus trickled down in sauces or broths. Others claim luxuries remained locked at the high table, leaving servants as hungry as before. Perhaps the truth, as so often, lay in between. The scraps of luxury fed imagination even when bellies stayed empty. Step into the kitchen as new goods arrive. Scullions unpack raisins, dropping a few into their mouths before the steward turns his back. A cook lifts a sack of flour, inhaling deeply, savouring the promise of softer bread. Another servant splashes olive oil into a pot, marvelling at the sheen on the surface. The air hums with energy, as though spring itself had slipped briefly into the room. Another curious tidbit appears in records of river trade. Even when ice froze the water, barges were sometimes dragged across by men or animals to deliver grain. Imagine the sight: a crew straining against ropes, hauling a frozen barge across ice, their breath clouding, their boots slipping, all for the promise of bread in some far-off castle. Hunger drove ingenuity, and ingenuity delivered survival. Now picture the hall after such a delivery. The lord raises a goblet of fresh wine, its red hue glowing in the firelight. His guests toast loudly, savouring the warmth it brings. At the benches, servants dip bread into broth enriched with raisins or almonds. It is still simple, but the sweetness transforms it into something memorable. The mood lifts, laughter rings louder. For one night, the weight of scarcity eases. Scholars note that winter trade shaped more than meals, it shaped identity. To serve imported spices or fruit was to declare a castle's connection to the wider world, a signal of wealth and power. Food became geography on a plate, carrying stories of coasts, rivers, and distant ports. To taste saffron was to taste Spain. To sip wine was to sip the labor of vineyards hundreds of miles away. You lift a slice of bread sweetened with raisins, chew slowly, and let the flavor linger. The sweetness is faint, but compared to porridge, it feels like wonder. The hall glows with firelight. Voices rise with cheer, and you realize that winter survival was not only about stores hidden in cellars, it was about connections, wagons, rivers, markets, the fragile threads that tied a stone castle to the vast world beyond its walls. So, on the coldest nights, when hunger loomed like a shadow, relief sometimes arrived in the form of wheels creaking into the courtyard. Trade brought not just food, but hope, the assurance that beyond the snow and scarcity, there was a world still moving, still growing, still sending sustenance across frozen miles. The wagons rumble away, leaving behind barrels of fish, sacks of flour, and baskets of fruit gleaming like jewels in the firelight. Yet even with trade and storage, even with careful rationing, hunger remained a constant companion in medieval castles. The coldest nights tested not only the larders but also the stomachs, as monotony, scarcity, and longing gnawed almost as fiercely as emptiness itself. Castle chronicles sometimes mention short commons, a phrase used when rations were reduced. Imagine the steward standing before weary servants, announcing that portions of bread and ale would be halved until spring. A groan ripples across the hall. Some mutter, others bow their heads in silence. The logic is cruel but simple. Better half-fed for weeks than fully fed for days, only to starve later. One haunting detail appears in a record from a northern English stronghold during a harsh winter. Guards were given only 3 meals of thin pottage per week. Between, they chewed bark, roots, or scraps of leather softened in boiling water. Picture a soldier gnawing on a strip of hide, his teeth grinding the tough fibers, his eyes hollow with fatigue. Such extremes were rare, but they reveal the razor's edge of survival. Some historians argue that chronic hunger was universal, gnawing at nobles and servants alike. Others insist nobles were largely shielded, their hunger more boredom than pain. The debate remains unsettled, but the truth is clear in the records of illness. Scurvy, weakness, and fainting plagued all ranks when winter stretched too long. Hunger was democracy's shadow, it spared no one completely. Imagine the hall on such a night. Servants shuffle with bowls of watery broth, barely a sliver of onion floating in each. The noble's table receives more, but even there, portions are thin, and meat appears less often. Conversation is muted, laughter rare. The fire crackles, but the warmth feels hollow. Hunger has a way of dampening even the brightest candlelight. An unusual anecdote from French folklore claims that eating candle wax was a last resort for the starving. Servants whispered of children nibbling hardened drips from chapel altars. Whether true or not, the story captures desperation. In the biting cold of February, even wax carried the idea of sustenance. Specialists continue to discuss whether hunger inspired more discipline or more unrest. Some records describe households drawing closer, bound by shared hardship. Others mention thefts, quarrels, and even riots in kitchens when rations grew too small. The tension of hunger sharpened everything. Every stare at another's trencher, every sigh at a neighbor's fuller bowl. Step into the dormitories late at night. Servants lie awake, stomachs growling. One whispers of the feast he once ate at Christmas, roasted goose, pies stuffed with raisins. Another mutters that he dreams only of bread, a crust big enough to fill both hands. The air is thick with longing, hunger's ghost pressing against every rib. Sleep comes, but it is restless, filled with visions of food that never arrives. A curious tidbit preserved in a letter from a traveling monk notes that some households tried to ease hunger with distraction, songs, games, or storytelling in the hall. A minstrel's tune or a juggler's act gave people something else to think about, if only for an hour. Imagine the relief of laughter, even on an empty stomach, the body briefly forgetting its ache. Now picture yourself with a trencher of stale bread. It is hard, dry, almost tasteless. You gnaw at it slowly, your jaw aching, swallowing with difficulty. And yet, as it reaches your stomach, you feel a flicker of warmth, the faintest easing of pain. You close your eyes, chewing more carefully, willing yourself to imagine butter, honey, anything richer. Hunger is not only physical, it is imagination clawing at memory. Another odd note appears in chronicles of siege. When castles were cut off and supplies ran out, hunger became brutal. Rats, dogs, even boiled horsehides entered the record as food. Though siege was not ordinary life, the echoes of those extremes haunted winter meals. Every bite of pottage carried the unspoken fear of what might come if stores truly failed. Scholars often remind us that hunger was not only absence, but rhythm. People lived with it as part of their calendar. They expected it after Christmas, dreaded it in February, prayed for spring. It shaped moods, choices, even faith. To eat enough was blessing. To endure hunger was penance. Either way, it was woven into the fabric of castle life. You sit now by the fire, your belly half full, your thoughts circling food like moths to flame. The hall quiets, but the ache remains, dull and constant. Outside, the snow deepens, the wind howls. Inside, hunger curls up in every stomach, patient as a wolf. And yet, even in its presence, life goes on. Bowls are washed, fires banked, prayers whispered. Survival, though fragile, continues. So, on the coldest nights, hunger was both companion and tormentor. It sharpened senses, fueled dreams, and bound households together in shared longing. To live in a castle in winter was to live with hunger, not as stranger, but as resident, ever present, ever waiting. The memory of hunger lingers long after the bowls are emptied, but winter nights in the castle also carried another layer of meaning. Food was not simply eaten and forgotten, it was remembered, retold, and celebrated in stories that wove together history, myth, and identity. The coldest evenings became occasions for recalling great feasts, strange dishes, or half-magical recipes said to have once graced noble tables. In these retellings, food became legend. Medieval chronicles often record banquets less for their menu than for their spectacle. Imagine a servant leaning close to the fire, whispering to his companions about the time a pie was cut open and live birds flew out, or when a swan was served redressed in feathers, its beak gilded, its body steaming. Such marvels, whether real or exaggerated, grew larger with each telling. For servants who ate only broth and bread that night, memory of splendor warmed them almost as much as meat itself. One vivid detail comes from a Burgundian court feast, where sugar sculptures shaped like castles and ships were displayed before being broken apart and eaten. The tale spread across Europe, whispered in humbler halls. Imagine, a fortress you could eat. In a drafty dormitory, guards chuckled at the absurdity, yet some half believed that one day such wonders might grace their own lord's table. Some historians argue that these stories served as propaganda, reinforcing noble prestige through tales of abundance. Others suggest they were entertainment for all ranks, a way to lighten the monotony of daily meals with imagination. Perhaps both are true. The stories dazzled nobles while feeding the dreams of those below. Picture the hall on a February night. The meal is plain pottage, bread, ale. Yet after, when trenchers are cleared, a minstrel rises and begins to sing of King Arthur's feasts, where tables groaned under golden dishes and wine flowed like rivers. The guards smile, the servants lean closer, even the lord nods approvingly. For a moment, everyone eats with their ears, filling their hunger with legend. An unusual anecdote from a Scottish chronicle describes a phantom banquet said to appear on certain winter nights, where travellers claimed to see ghostly tables laden with food in abandoned halls. The tale was retold in castles, half jest, half warning. Hunger itself might conjure illusions. Imagine servants shivering in their beds, dreaming of spectral roasts and endless bread, waking to find only turnips in the pot. Specialists still debate how much of these food legends were rooted in fact. Some argue the stories were exaggerated memories of real feasts. Others see them as allegories, moral tales warning against gluttony or boasting of generosity. But regardless of origin, the effect was the same. They gave shape to longing, turned scarcity into narrative, and reminded people that food could be more than fuel, it could be story. Step into the kitchen after supper. A scullion too young to remember last year's feast begs the cook for stories. She laughs, wiping her hands, and tells him of the time a goose was roasted with apples in its belly, so fragrant the hall fell silent as it was carved. His eyes widen, his stomach growls, and though he knows he will only eat porridge tomorrow, he falls asleep later with the taste of apples in his imagination. Another curious tidbit from English folklore links feasts with prophecy. It was said that a household's fortune for the year could be judged by the richness of its Christmas meal. A fat goose meant prosperity. A thin broth meant hardship. Whether believed literally or not, the tale added weight to each winter feast, making the food symbolic of destiny itself. Now picture yourself seated near the fire, belly half empty but heart full of stories. Around you, servants share memories. The night the Lord gave them spiced wine, the day a merchant brought oranges, the rumor of a feast where sugar castles crumbled like snow. You listen, eyes heavy, the hunger in your stomach softened by the banquet in your mind. Scholars note that oral tradition preserved much of medieval food culture. Recipes were rarely written down for common dishes. Instead, they were carried in memory, told from cook to cook, grandmother to child. To remember a stew, to tell its tale, was itself an act of survival. The story was as important as the taste. So on the coldest nights, when storerooms were thin and bowls meagre, castles nourished themselves with memory and myth. Feasts were retold, marvels recited, legends whispered. Food became story, story became comfort, and comfort became sustenance. In a world where hunger pressed hard, imagination set the table as surely as any cook. The stories of feasts fade into the smoky rafters, and the hall grows quiet once more. The bowls have been cleared, the hearth banked for the night, and the servants retreat to their straw pallets, bellies neither full nor empty, but somewhere in between. The cold presses harder now, seeping through the walls and under the doors. Yet even in this stillness, food remains on everyone's mind, not in the form of feasts or legends, but as the quiet rhythm of survival itself. Castle inventories remind us that the cycle of eating never paused. Tomorrow the steward will rise early, tally the sacks of barley, check the barrels of fish, measure out the ale. The cook will prepare another pot of pottage, adding whatever scraps remain, stretching them into something edible. The guards will grumble at the monotony. The children will slurp greedily, and the Lord will frown if his meat is too salty or his bread too stale. The cycle turns, again and again, through every night of frost. One striking detail comes from a French household account that describes how food was rationed even by hour. Servants received small bites at dawn before labor, then their main portion at evening. The long gap in between was endured with weak ale or crusts tucked secretly into pockets. Imagine a maid pausing in the icy corridor, sneaking a chew of bread to keep her strength, praying no steward catches her. Hunger made thieves of the innocent. Some historians argue that winter eating habits in castles revealed resilience, a discipline forged by centuries of scarcity. Others suggest they revealed fragility, showing just how close even mighty households hovered to collapse. The debate continues, but in the smoky air of a January night, both truths are visible: resilience in the steaming bowls, fragility in the thinness of their contents. Picture the castle on its coldest night. The wind moans through the battlements. The snow heaps against the gatehouse. The torches sputter. Inside, The great hall is dim. The nobles sit wrapped in furs, nibbling their remaining luxuries, cheese cut thin, bread sliced carefully, wine sipped rather than gulped. At the benches, guards and servants chew their pottage slowly, savouring what little meat floats in it. Children lick their bowls clean, their eyes heavy with sleep. Everyone eats, but no one is sated. An unusual anecdote from English folklore tells of households placing crumbs on window ledges for wandering spirits during winter nights. The belief was that if the dead were fed, the living would not go hungry. Perhaps it was superstition, or perhaps it was a way to share scarcity with unseen company. Either way, it shows how even crumbs carried meaning in the dark. Another curious tidbit appears in medical texts of the era. Scholars argued whether cold food harmed the body more than hunger itself. Some insisted only hot meals gave strength in winter, while others claimed bread alone sufficed. You can almost picture them debating by firelight, quills scratching, while their servants boiled the same barley broth night after night. Theories mattered little when bellies growled. Step once more into the kitchen before dawn. The embers glow faintly. The air smells of ash and grease. A scullion yawns, pours water into a cauldron, and begins again. He does not wonder whether it is feast or famine, he knows the answer. It is both. Always both. The castle lives in a constant dance between abundance and absence, and winter sharpens that dance into necessity. Now picture yourself with a bowl of porridge, steam curling upward. You lift a spoon, taste the blandness, feel it spread warmth inside you. It is not joy, but it is survival. You lean back, close your eyes, and listen to the faint chorus of others chewing, slurping, sighing. Hunger still sits beside you, but you realize it is quieter than before. For now, at least, the night is endurable. Scholars note that in the end, food in medieval castles was not about luxury alone, nor deprivation alone, but balance. Spices dazzled the high table, pottage filled the low. Leftovers stretched meals, superstition gave meaning, trade brought relief. On the coldest nights, survival depended not on one feast but on countless small acts, a bowl reheated, a scrap shared, a story told. So, as the last embers fade and the castle sinks into silence, you understand the truth. What people really ate in medieval castles during the coldest nights of the year was everything from venison spiced with saffron to nettle stew boiled in desperation. They ate bread both white and dark, fish both fresh and salted, porridge both rich and thin. They ate according to rank, according to season, according to faith, and according to luck. They ate not to feast, but to endure. And endure they did. For every winter eventually gave way to spring. Every storeroom eventually filled again. Every hunger eventually eased. But the memory of those cold nights lingered, shaping how people stored, shared, and remembered food. In the end, the castle's meals were more than survival. They were a mirror of the world itself. Unequal, imaginative, ritualized, and stubbornly resilient. And now, as our long journey through the castle's kitchens and halls comes to its close, let the clamour fade into stillness. The torches gutter, the bowls are empty, and the heavy doors groan against the winter wind. You can almost hear the soft breathing of servants on their pallets, the crackle of embers buried deep in ash, the faint drip of melted snow from the eaves. The images of food, salted meats, stews of barley, gilded peacocks, humble porridge still linger, but they soften now, slipping into shadow. Let them drift from your mind like smoke rising toward rafters. Instead, focus on the quiet rhythm of survival that echoed through every meal. The spoon lifted, the bread broken, the prayer whispered. In the deepest cold, these simple acts bound the castle together. As you rest, imagine yourself seated in that hall, not as noble or servant, but as witness. You have tasted the richness of spice and the bitterness of nettles, heard the debates of scholars and the songs of minstrels, seen scraps shared and leftovers cherished. And through it all, you have felt the steady pulse of resilience. Now let the clinking knives and murmured prayers fade into a hush. Let the warmth of the hearth seep into your bones, the steam of broth curl gently around your face. The hunger of history is not yours tonight. You are full with story, with memory, with quiet. Breathe slowly. Feel the weight of blankets, the softness of the dark. Outside, the snow falls, silent and steady. Inside, you are safe, carried by the rhythm of centuries past. Let go of the castle, the cold, the hunger. Drift gently now, into warmth, into peace, into sleep. Sweet dreams.